Hey guys, tonight, we're uncovering one of history's most carefully buried secrets. What if I told you that in medieval Europe, an era we're constantly told was dark, brutal, and suffocating for women, some of the happiest, wealthiest, and most powerful people alive were women who deliberately chose to live without men. Not widows scraping by, not tragic spinsters waiting to be rescued, but sharp-minded, ambitious women who looked at marriage, looked at the legal reality of it, and said, very clearly, absolutely not. They built businesses, they owned property, they signed contracts, they sued people in court and won. They traveled freely, hosted lavish dinners, maintained deep friendships, and went to sleep every night knowing their lives belonged entirely to them. And here's the part that should make you lean a little closer to the screen. They were so successful, so visibly content, that medieval society eventually panicked and tried to erase them from history altogether. Tonight, their stories come back. Before we step into this forgotten world together, I've got to say, if stories like this genuinely fascinate you, the kind that flip everything you thought you knew about the past upside down, I'd love it if you hit subscribe. Only if you mean it. And quick question, where are you watching from tonight? Cozy in bed with tea? Or sneaking this in during a late study break? I read every comment, and honestly, your stories always make my day. All right, dim the lights. Let's go back about 700 years. It's London, 1287, that you're walking through Cheapside Market, the busiest commercial artery in the city. The air is thick with the smell of spices, wool, and fresh bread. Merchants shout over one another. Coins clink. Deals are sealed with a nod and a handshake. And then something stops you. The most prosperous merchant stall on the street, the one stacked with imported French wine, fine Flemish cloth, and goods from Italy, isn't run by a burly guild master, it's run by a woman. Her name is Marjorie de Clare. She owns 3 shops. She owns 2 houses. And just days ago, she closed a wine import deal worth more than most nobles earn in an entire year. According to court records, she's described as prosperous, respected, and living her most excellent life. That last part isn't poetic license. That is an actual phrase pulled from a 13th century legal document. And here's the detail that made medieval society deeply uncomfortable. Marjorie has never been married, no husband, no guardian, no intention of changing that. And she is thriving. Now, you might be thinking, okay, interesting story, but surely she was a rare exception. A historical fluke. She wasn't. City records from medieval London tell a far more explosive story. By the late 1200s, 23% of all property-owning merchants in the city were unmarried women. Almost 1 in 4. These numbers aren't guesses. They come directly from London Guild records preserved in the British National Archives. Unmarried women weren't hiding on the margins of medieval commerce. They were everywhere, and they were successful. Oh, how was this even possible in a society we've been told gave women no power at all? The answer lies in a legal loophole that functioned like a superpower. These women had a legal status known as femme sole, literally meaning woman alone. And despite how it sounds today, this wasn't a label of pity or shame. It was freedom. Under medieval law, marriage erased women. A married woman's money, property, and legal identity automatically became her husband's. She couldn't sign contracts. She couldn't sue. She couldn't independently control her income. But an unmarried woman, she could own land. She could run businesses. She could travel freely. She could take people to court. Marriage wasn't protection, that it was a cage. And some women understood this with terrifying clarity. Take Agnes Sampson of 14th century York. This woman was essentially the medieval equivalent of a venture capitalist. She owned a textile empire that stretched across 3 countries, employed more than 200 people, and controlled supply chains that most men couldn't even comprehend. And somehow, against all odds, some of her personal letters survived. I in one of them, written to a business partner. Agnes casually drops a line that still hits like a punch across 7 centuries. Marriage? I'd rather kiss a plague rat. My gold stays in my purse, and thank you very much. That sentence alone dismantles everything we're taught about medieval women. And here's the thing that makes this story even more dangerous. These women weren't lonely. They weren't bitter. They weren't secretly miserable, Court records, diaries, and church documents reveal women who, through dinner parties, traveled extensively, maintained deep friendships, and lived remarkably full lives. The diary of Isabella de Fortibus, one of the wealthiest landowners in 13th century England, describes mornings spent managing estates, afternoons studying with scholars, and evenings filled with music and storytelling among friends. She writes, "I wake each day grateful that my choices are mine alone." That sentence terrified medieval society, because if women could be happy, wealthy, and fulfilled without husbands, then marriage stopped being a necessity and became a choice. And once that idea took root, everything started to unravel. Church leaders began preaching that unmarried women were against God's natural order. Legal scholars warned that women living alone were dangerous to social stability. Even language itself was twisted into a weapon. The word spinster, which once simply meant a woman who spun wool, a skilled and respectable profession, slowly morphed into an insult. History wasn't just forgetting these women that it was actively rewriting the story to make their independence seem tragic instead of triumphant. But the women themselves weren't fooled. In a letter dated 1342, Merchant Eleanor de Montfort wrote to her niece, "They call us unnatural because we threaten their natural order." Let them. A woman's worth is not measured by the man beside her, but by the life she builds with her own hands. 700 years ago, she already knew the truth. And this is only the beginning. Because some medieval women didn't just choose independence quietly. They took it further. They built entire alternative societies where women lived, worked, aged, and thrived together, without husbands, without vows, and without permission. Now let's travel north, across muddy roads and windswept fields, into the misty lowlands of medieval Flanders. It's the year 1230. The morning fog clings to the cobblestones as you approach what looks like a small village tucked inside the bustling city of Bruges. From the outside, it seems quiet, peaceful, almost ordinary. But the moment you step closer, you realize something here is very, very different. This isn't a monastery, it isn't a noble estate, and it definitely isn't a neighborhood built around families and husbands. This is a beguinage, and what you're about to witness will quietly shatter everything you think you know about medieval women. Inside these walls lives a community of women called beguines. They are not nuns. They have taken no lifelong vows. They are free to leave whenever they choose, and they are absolutely, unapologetically unmarried. While the rest of Europe is still debating whether women are capable of rational thought, these women have already solved problems modern society still struggles with today: work-life balance, affordable housing, retirement security, healthcare, financial independence. And they did it about 700 years before anyone coined the word feminism. Here's the part that still makes historians sit back in their chairs. That'd be why the early 1300s there were more than 200,000 beguines across northern Europe. 200,000. That's not a fringe movement. That's not a curiosity. That's larger than most medieval cities. We're talking about a massive, organized, female-led social experiment that functioned in plain sight for centuries. These women lived together in gated communities designed for safety and autonomy. Each woman had her own small house. She earned her own income. She controlled her own time. No husband, no father, no male guardian. And unlike convents, beguines weren't locked into religious obedience. They worked at Did they work? The beguines dominated the textile industry across Flanders, Germany, and the Low Countries. They didn't just spin wool. They controlled entire supply chains, raw materials, production, quality control, and export. Records from the Bruges City Archive show that by 1300, beguine workshops produced roughly 60% of all fine cloth exported from the region. 60%. Medieval Europe did not just rely on these women. It was economically dependent on them. And this is where things get truly fascinating. The beguines had invented what modern sociologists now call intentional communities. Every aspect of life was designed around independence without isolation. You worked in the morning. You studied or prayed in the afternoon. You shared meals, music, and conversation in the evening. That if you got sick, other women cared for you. That if you grew old, younger beguines supported you. That if you wanted to leave, You could, in O shame, in O punishment, in O loss of dignity. One Begin founder wrote about the great freedom of this life, describing how she woke each morning knowing her day belonged entirely to her. No husband to serve, no children she hadn't chosen, no male authority she was obligated to obey. Her words radiate a quiet joy that feels almost shocking from medieval writing. And then there's Marguerite Porete. She lived in the late 1200s in France and was a beguine so intellectually fearless that even modern readers feel the heat of her ideas. While most people couldn't read at all, she wrote philosophical treatises exploring personal freedom, spiritual autonomy, and the radical idea that individuals could have a direct relationship with God without intermediaries. Her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, terrified church authorities, not because it was incoherent, but because it made sense. They burned Marguerite at the stake in 1310, but they couldn't burn her ideas. Her writing survived, copied in secret, influencing mystical thought for centuries, and her death sent a clear message. These women weren't dangerous because they were weak. They were dangerous because they were right. And yet, despite moments like this, the Beguines endured. Why? Because they were too useful to destroy. When King Philip IV of France tried to suppress them in 1312, the textile markets nearly collapsed. Guild records from Ghent show that cloth production dropped by 40% within months. Exports plummeted. Neighboring regions began poaching beguine workers with better terms. The king quietly reversed course. It turns out you can't torch the economic backbone of your country just because independent women make you uncomfortable. What truly sets the Beguines apart, though, isn't just their economic success, it's their emotional lives. Letters exchanged between Beguines, preserved in archives across Europe, reveal women who are not merely surviving. They're thriving. They write about deep friendships, intellectual excitement, creative fulfillment, and something they mention again and again: the joy of belonging to ourselves. Many Beguines lived into their 80s and 90s, which was nearly miraculous for medieval times. Medical historians believe their longevity came from lower stress, strong social bonds, financial security, and freedom from the dangers of repeated childbirth. They weren't just living better, they were living longer. The Beguines proved something medieval society desperately didn't want to accept: that women didn't need husbands to be safe, but they didn't need marriage to be fulfilled. That given freedom and opportunity, women could build lives of extraordinary richness. But make no mistake, even as successful as these communities were, they existed inside a world that fundamentally did not want them to exist. They survived through careful balance, economic usefulness, spiritual framing, strategic humility, and not every woman had the luxury of building an entire alternative society. Because while the Beguines were thriving behind their walls, another group of women was about to discover an even more dangerous kind of freedom: widowhood. And for some medieval women, widowhood wasn't an ending, that it was a power-up. Step with me now into the candlelit halls of 14th century Venice. Heavy silk curtains muffle the noise of the canals outside. Gold glints off polished tables. Incense hangs in the air. And behind these doors, decisions are being made that will shape empires, trade routes, and wars. But here's the detail that history textbooks tend to whisper, if they mention it at all. Many of the most powerful figures in these rooms are not men. They are widows. Meet Caterina Cornaro. In 1473, when her husband, the king of Cyprus, died, the world expected Caterina to do what widows were supposed to do: retreat, mourn, fade quietly into the background. Instead, she put on a crown. For 15 years, Caterina ruled Cyprus with such skill that Venetian officials described her as more capable than 10 men. She negotiated trade agreements, stabilized the economy, and played European powers against one another with frightening precision. And then she did something even more shocking. She voluntarily abdicated her throne. Not because she was forced to, not because she was weak, because she negotiated a deal so lucrative that she walked away one of the wealthiest individuals in all of Europe. And no husband, and no ruler above her. Just money, autonomy, and power. And here's the part that really changes everything. Katerina wasn't an exception in medieval Europe. Widowhood was the ultimate legal transformation. Under inheritance laws across most regions, when a husband died, his widow automatically gained control of 1/3 to 1/2 of his entire estate. Land, businesses, cash, political connections, and most importantly, full legal independence. Venetian state archives reveal something extraordinary. By the year 1400, widows controlled roughly 35% of all privately held wealth in Venice. 35%. That's not symbolic power. That's economic dominance. And these women weren't passive caretakers of dead men's fortunes. They were expanding empires. Take Alessandra Strozzi of Florence. When her husband died, he left behind 5 children and crushing debts. Society expected her to remarry quickly or collapse into poverty. Instead, Alessandra took over the family banking business. Her letters, preserved in the Florentine State Archives, read like a masterclass in medieval finance. She traded currencies across Europe, loaned money to nobles who desperately needed her favor, and strategically married her children into alliances that strengthened her position. She didn't survive widowhood. She weaponized it. Then there's Margherita d'Attini. When her husband Francesco died in 1410, she inherited an international trading network stretching from London to Constantinople. Instead of selling it off, she expanded it. Company records show that under Margherita's leadership, profits increased by 60% within 3 years. 60%. Men who had once dismissed her as merely a merchant's wife suddenly found themselves negotiating on her terms. What made these widows especially powerful was their understanding of leverage. They couldn't officially sit on councils or rule openly, but they mastered what historians now call soft power. They hosted dinners where trade deals were sealed. They financed wars and cathedrals. They controlled access to credit. If a king needed money, he didn't knock on the door of a guild master, he knocked on the door of a widow. English royal records show that when King Edward III needed funds for his campaigns in France, he turned to the wealthy widows of London, who collectively loaned him over 50,000 marks, the medieval equivalent of millions today. And here's the detail that makes this story deliciously rebellious. Many of these women refused to remarry because under medieval law, remarriage meant surrendering everything. Property, income, legal rights, all transferred instantly to the new husband. So these women did the math. Companionship or control, romance or sovereignty. They chose sovereignty. Isabella de Fordibus, whom we met earlier, turned down marriage proposals from 3 different kings. 3. Her response to the last proposal, preserved in English archives, is legendary. I have tasted the sweet wine of independence and find I have no appetite for the bitter bread of subjugation, regardless of how golden the plate upon which it is served. That sentence could start revolutions. But these widows didn't just build power for themselves. They lifted other women with them. Records show them creating dowry funds for poor girls, business opportunities for other widows, and informal networks of female economic support. Margaret Potton referred to her circle as a sisterhood of independence, regularly loaning money to women starting businesses or escaping bad marriages. They also revolutionized philanthropy. Instead of donating blindly to churches, many widows funded education, healthcare, and social services. In 1456, Florentine widow Francesca Pittaroni established the first known scholarship fund specifically for girls' education. Her founding document states, "Education is the greatest gift one can give to ensure a woman's independence." These women understood something terrifyingly modern. Power doesn't last forever unless you build structures that outlive you. So they created foundations, endowments, and institutions that survived for centuries. Some of them still exist today. Widowhood, for these women, wasn't tragedy. It was transformation. But while aristocratic widows were reshaping politics from palaces and counting houses, something equally revolutionary was happening in markets, workshops, and taverns across Europe. Because not every woman inherited power. Some of them built it from nothing. And the self-made medieval businesswomen you're about to meet will make modern startup founders look like amateurs. Imagine a city waking up. Not. The polished postcard version of medieval Europe, but the real thing. Narrow streets, slick with yesterday's rain. Wooden houses leaning into each other like conspirators. The smell of bread, animals' dye vats, and human sweat all colliding in the cold morning air. This is Paris, 1368. And somewhere in this chaos, a woman named Jean Le Boursier is already awake. She isn't noble. She isn't educated in Latin. She doesn't have a father's workshop to inherit or a husband's business to fall back on. What she has is a sharp eye, relentless discipline, and a refusal to accept the life she was told to live. Jean starts as a street vendor selling secondhand clothing. Used cloaks, mended tunics, cast-off silks from households that don't even notice what they throw away. But Jean notices everything. She notices which fabrics sell fastest in winter, which colors move quickest near church holidays, which neighborhoods pay more and which try to cheat her. She notices that foreign merchants underprice locals and that poor women will buy on credit if treated with dignity. And she builds her empire from there. Within 5 years, Jean owns 3 stalls. Within 10, she controls the largest resale clothing operation in her quarter. By 1385, tax records list her among the top commercial earners in Paris. And no husband ever appears in her records. And that silence is deliberate, because Jean understands something most people never do. Marriage would end her business overnight. Under Parisian law, a husband would instantly gain legal control of her earnings, her inventory, her contracts. If he mismanaged them, she would have no recourse. If he incurred debt, her wealth would be seized. So Jean remains single, not lonely, not isolated, strategic. She hires other women, widows, abandoned wives, young girls with sharp minds and nowhere to go. She pays them fairly. She trains them brutally well to be by the time she's 50. Jean employs over 60 people. Her competitors hate her. Guild leaders despise her because she's doing something unforgivable. She's winning. Across Europe, women like Jean are doing the same thing quietly, relentlessly, and in staggering numbers. In London, Alice Penrose runs a brewing operation so successful that court records accuse her of excessive prosperity. That is not a metaphor. It's a real charge. Her ale is better. Her prices are fairer. And she pays her workers on time. Men try to shut her down. They accuse her of watering down beer. Inspectors show up weekly. Fines rain down. But Alice knows the law better than they do. She fights every charge. And she wins. One frustrated official writes that prosecuting her is like wrestling smoke. She never remarries after her first husband dies, because she's not stupid. In Cologne, Gertrude von Bergen begins as a washerwoman. Backbreaking labor, pennies a day. But Gertrude notices something others don't. Textile merchants hate doing laundry. It waste time. It ruins hands. And demand never stops. Gertrude organizes. She recruits other women, standardizes prices, creates pickup routes, negotiates exclusive contracts. By the 1390s, Gertrude controls nearly all commercial laundering in her district. She owns property. She lends money. She is sued by male competitors who accuse her of monopolistic behavior. The court dismisses the case because it's true that in Florence, Mona Tessa begins as a wet nurse. One of the lowest status jobs a woman can have. But she builds relationships. She gains trust. Wealthy families ask her for advice, then favors, then introductions. She becomes indispensable. Eventually, she opens a foundling hospital funded entirely through private donations she personally secures. She manages its finances with such precision that city officials consult her on unrelated budgets. She never marries. Her obituary states simply, she lacked a husband but not authority. And here's what connects all these women. They're invisible in textbooks because their power is inconvenient. They didn't rule kingdoms. They didn't lead armies. They didn't leave behind grand portraits or dynasties. They did something far more dangerous. They proved that women could succeed in capitalism before capitalism had a name. By the late 1300s, women ran between 30 and 40% of small businesses in major European cities. 0.30 to 40%. That number doesn't come from feminist fantasy. It comes from tax rolls, court documents, guild disputes, and city censuses, and it terrified men in power that the backlash began. Not all at once, not openly, but surgically, guilds slowly rewrote their membership rules. Professions that women had dominated for centuries suddenly required formal apprenticeships that excluded them. New laws restricted women's ability to sue independently. Taxes were raised selectively on female-owned businesses, and language did the rest. Successful women became scheming. Assertive women became unfeminine. Independent women became suspicious. The archetype of the dangerous woman began to form. And then something darker took hold. Because when legal pressure wasn't enough, fear became the weapon. Between 1450 and 1650, tens of thousands of women across Europe would be accused of witchcraft. And here's the detail most people never heard: a disproportionate number of them were unmarried, widowed, childless, or economically independent women. Midwives, healers, brewers, landowners, moneylenders, women who owned things, women who knew things, women who didn't answer to anyone. Trial records reveal accusations that sound less like superstition and more like social resentment. She lives alone. She has too much money. She does not fear men. She speaks boldly. In one German case, a woman is accused because her neighbors say she acts as if she belongs to herself. That was enough. The witch hunts were not just hysteria. They were social correction that a warning etched in fire and blood. And it worked to be why the 1600s, women's economic independence had been dramatically curtailed. Professions once dominated by women were fully male-controlled. Laws tightened. Opportunities vanished. History didn't forget these women by accident. IT buried them on purpose. But fragments survived, in dusty court records, in account books, in letters never meant to last. And now, you're hearing their voices again. These women weren't anomalies. They weren't miracles. They were proof of a path not taken down a version of history where independence was possible, tested, and then deliberately dismantled. And that leaves us with one final, haunting question that if medieval women could build. Lives this rich, this powerful, this free? What exactly were we told had to wait until modern times? One last part remains that by the time the 15th century arrived, nothing dramatic had happened that single decree declared that women would no longer live freely. No announcement rang through city squares saying independence was over. Instead, something quieter took place. The rules changed a little, then a little more, then just enough that no one noticed all at once. Universities that had once tolerated exceptional women quietly stopped admitting them. Guilds that had relied on female labor rewrote their charters to require apprenticeships boys could access and girls could not. Courts that had once treated unmarried women as legal adults began to question their credibility, then their competence, then their right to stand alone at all. Each change was small enough to justify, each one reasonable on its own. Together, they were devastating, and just as important as the legal shift was the narrative shift, because power doesn't only disappear when it's taken. It disappears when people are convinced it never existed. Chronicles began to change their tone. Women who had once been described as prosperous became fortunate widows. Business owners became wives of merchants. Success was reattributed, reframed, or quietly stripped of agency. Even language was repurposed. Spinster stopped meaning a skilled worker and started meaning a failure. Independent stopped meaning capable and started meaning suspicious. Unmarried stopped meaning free and started meaning incomplete. This wasn't accidental. It was strategic, because as long as people remembered that women had once lived full, autonomous lives, the restrictions being placed on them would feel temporary, reversible. Memory had to go, and so did context. Later generations were taught that medieval women were universally oppressed, universally powerless, universally trapped. Not because it was true, but because it made the present order feel inevitable, that if women had always been dependent, then dependence wasn't a choice imposed on them. It was nature. But cracks kept forming, because the records refused to fully cooperate. Tax rolls still listed women paying enormous sums. Court cases still showed women suing men and winning. Property deeds still carried female names scratched in a parchment where no one had bothered to erase them completely. And occasionally, a voice slipped through to a letter complaining about a woman who will not submit to guidance. A sermon warning against women who prefer self-rule to marriage. A legal note describing a woman as too accustomed to command. Those aren't descriptions of helpless people, they're descriptions of a problem. What followed next wasn't immediate collapse. It was tension, a long, grinding pressure between women who had already tasted autonomy and systems now determined to limit it. Some adapted, some resisted quietly, some were punished, some disappeared from the records altogether. And this is where the story actually gets dangerous, because when legal erosion isn't enough, societies reach for fear. Not yet the fires, not yet the trials, but the groundwork, suspicion, whispers, moral panic. Independent women began to be discussed not as economic actors, but as social threats, as disorder, as instability, as something that needed correction for the good of everyone. This is the moment where the tone of history changes, where tolerance turns to hostility, where independence stops being inconvenient and starts being framed as dangerous. And this shift didn't happen because women suddenly changed. IT happened because they hadn't. They were still working, still owning property, still refusing marriages, still supporting each other, still acting like their lives belonged to them. Which meant the next phase wasn't about forgetting anymore. IT was about enforcement, and that. Part of the story is still ahead. The shift didn't announce itself as violence. IT first, it called itself concern. City councils began asking new questions. Who lived alone? Who earned without oversight? Who taught other women skills instead of directing them toward marriage? None of these questions were illegal. They were framed as responsible governance. But lists started forming in German towns. Officials compiled registers of women who owned property without husbands. In England, church courts took an interest in women who skipped remarriage too long. In Italy, neighborhoods were encouraged to report women who held gatherings that were unsupervised. Nothing happened immediately. That was the point. Surveillance always comes before punishment. Sermons changed tone. Where independence had once been tolerated as unusual, it was now framed as a moral imbalance. Preachers warned that women without male authority were vulnerable to pride, temptation, and disorder. Not evil yet, just risky, and risk invites management. Medical theory joined in. University-trained physicians, now almost entirely male, began publishing treatises claiming women were physically and mentally unstable when not regulated by marriage or childbirth. They described independence as unnatural heat in the body, excess imagination, misplaced ambition. This wasn't science. IT was justification. Because once a group is defined as unstable, controlling them becomes care, not oppression. Midwives felt this shift first. For centuries, they had been trusted figures passing knowledge from woman to woman. They knew herbs, births, bodies, and grief. They were paid well, respected. Now, suddenly, they were accused of secrecy. Their knowledge was no longer wisdom. It was suspicion. Licensing laws appeared. Training moved into universities that excluded women. Practices that had been ordinary for generations were labeled unregulated, improper, dangerous. Healers followed. Women who treated neighbors for fevers, pain, infertility, or injury were told to stop, or register, or submit to oversight by men who had never touched a patient outside a lecture hall. Many refused. And refusal, in this new climate, was not neutral. Economic pressure tightened. That women-owned businesses faced inspections, fines, and accusations that had nothing to do with quality and everything to do with compliance. Breweries run by women were suddenly dangerous. Cloth produced by women was suddenly substandard. Money lent by women was suddenly immoral. The pattern was consistent. If a woman operated independently, her work was reframed as a threat. And then the stories began. Whispers at first, then rumors, then patterns that a woman who lived alone was said to be unnatural. A woman who succeeded financially was said to be greedy. A woman who spoke confidently was said to be arrogant. None of these were crimes, but together they formed a portrait. And portraits can be weaponized. By the late 15th century, pamphlets circulated describing dangerous women who disrupted social harmony. They were said to seduce men, corrupt children, mock religion, and undermine authority. Notice what's missing. Magic. This stage, no one is talking about spells. They're talking about control, about women who don't fit, women who won't fold, women who make others uncomfortable simply by existing without permission. The word which hasn't fully arrived yet, but the role has. Because once a society decides that independence itself is suspicious, it only takes one more step to label it monstrous. And that step is always justified as protection. Protection of families, protection of morality, protection of order. And when protection becomes the reason, almost anything can be done in its name. What comes next isn't chaos, it's organization. Manuals, procedures, legal frameworks, a system being built carefully, deliberately, and with terrifying patience. Because the goal was never random punishment, it was obedience. And the women who had lived for generations, as if their lives belonged to them, were about to learn something brutal. The era of tolerance was over, and the machinery was ready. Once the machinery was built, it didn't rush. It didn't need to be. Why the early 16th century, Europe was already primed. People have been trained, slowly and thoroughly, to see certain women as problems before anyone ever called them witches. The woman who lived alone too long, the widow who refused remarriage, the healer who didn't need permission, the businesswoman who hired other women instead of submitting to a guild. Why now? These figures were familiar, unsettling, talked about. All the system needed was a name. That name arrived in 1487. A book appeared that would change everything. It wasn't folklore. It wasn't rumor. It was a manual, cold, methodical, and written by men who believed they were saving society. The Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches. That IT didn't invent fear of witches. It organized IT explained, in careful legal language, why women were more susceptible to evil, why independence was evidence of corruption, why a woman who spoke boldly, lived alone, or rejected authority was not merely difficult, but dangerous. And most importantly, it explained how to prosecute her. This book spread faster than almost any other text in early print history, second only to the Bible in some regions. Judges used it. Clergy quoted it. Town councils leaned on it when they needed justification. What it created was consistency. Accusations stopped being random. Punishment stopped being improvised. Fear stopped being vague. Now it had a checklist. Did she live alone? Did she earn her own money? Did neighbors envy her? Did she show anger when accused? Did she show calm when accused? Both were signs. And here's the part that still feels chilling. Once independence itself was framed as evidence, innocence became impossible. Trials followed, a pattern that repeated across borders. That a woman is accused, often by neighbors, sometimes for failed crops, sometimes for illness, sometimes simply because she was disliked. But beneath the stated reason, the same details appear again and again. She would not marry. She kept her own counsel. She lived as if she were equal. Interrogations were designed not to discover truth, but to extract confession. Torture was legal. Silence was suspicious. Denial was arrogance. And the accusations grew. Economic independence became greed. Knowledge became heresy. Community influence became manipulation. Midwives were accused of harming infants. Healers of poisoning wells. Widows of seducing men for gain. Even kindness could be twisted that a woman who helped too many people must be hiding something. The terror spread not because people suddenly believed in magic, but because the cost of being different became unbearable. Women began to withdraw. They sold. Businesses, they remarried quickly. They stopped teaching skills to other women. They erased themselves, not because they were guilty, because survival required invisibility. And this is where the system became self-sustaining. Neighbors learned to watch each other. Women learned to correct each other. Mothers warned daughters not to stand out. The safest woman was the quiet one, the dependent one, the grateful one that the fires didn't need to burn everywhere. They only needed to burn enough. Across Germany, Switzerland, France, and parts of England, tens of thousands were accused. The exact number will never be known because records were destroyed, trials went undocumented, and some women simply vanished. But patterns remain clear. The majority were women. Most were over 40, that many were widowed, unmarried, or childless, that a striking number owned property or earned independently. This wasn't about magic, that IT was about control. And it worked by the mid-17th century. The figure of the independent woman had been successfully transformed into a cautionary tale. Freedom became something dangerous women wanted. Safety became something only obedience could provide. And when the trials finally faded, the lesson stayed that women's work moved back into the home. Knowledge was stripped of authority. Ambition was softened, mocked, or punished. What centuries of slow pressure hadn't fully erased, terror finished. But here's the part history rarely lingers on. Even this didn't fully succeed, because not all resistance is loud. Some women adapted without surrendering. Some passed knowledge in whispers, some rebuilt businesses under male names. Some created new forms of community that didn't look threatening enough to destroy. The fire taught them how to hide, and the system that broke them also revealed something it never intended to. That independence had been strong enough to require this much force to crush, that it had worked well enough to frighten institutions, that it had spread widely enough to demand coordination. You don't build this kind of machinery for something fragile. You build it for something resilient. And when the smoke cleared, Europe didn't return a balance. IT returned to order, in order that would be taught as tradition, in order that would be described as natural, in order that would claim it had always been this way. But beneath that order, something unresolved remained, that a memory without words, that a warning passed through generations, that a sense that stepping too far outside the line was dangerous, even when no one could explain why. And that quiet inheritance would shape women's lives, long after the last fire went out. Because the end of the witch hunts was not the end of the story, IT was the beginning of silence. After the flames of the witch hunts had died down, Europe exhaled a kind of collective relief. The stakes had been made painfully clear: to live freely, to own property, to be confident, to be content without a husband. Any of these things could be fatal. The survivors carried the message, not just as caution, but as doctrine. And the daughters, granddaughters, and apprentices of those survivors learned it too. The impact was slow, creeping, but incredibly pervasive. Over the next century, the lessons of terror were codified in every corner of life. Homes, guilds, schools, and religious institutions all became instruments of subtle enforcement. A girl's education was increasingly defined by preparation for marriage. A widow's inheritance was carefully monitored by male relatives or court-appointed guardians. Business opportunities for women shrank under the guise of propriety, piety, or legal necessity. Even language, which had begun to betray women centuries earlier, tightened its grip. Words that once celebrated independence, like spinster or widow as neutral identifiers, became tainted. Female autonomy, once described in terms of skill, enterprise, or wisdom, now carried undertones of deficiency, instability, or moral danger. Conversely, the language around men maintained its aspirational glow. Bachelor retained dignity. Widower implied resilience. Men's independence was framed as choice, women's as failure. Generations internalized this lesson without realizing it, and it became invisible like the very air they breathed. The economic impact was equally profound. Guilds that had once allowed women to flourish in trades increasingly favored men. Apprenticeships for women dwindled. Property laws, though nominally unchanged, were interpreted more restrictively. In towns across England, Germany, and the Low Countries, female entrepreneurs dwindled in visibility. The surviving businesswomen became exceptional anomalies, often forced to operate quietly or through proxies. Markets that had once thrived on women's participation slowly consolidated under male control. Yet even amid this oppression, threads of resilience endured. Some women refused to surrender entirely. They adapted, disguised their knowledge, or navigated the system with cunning. In Florence, a widow might hire her nephew as the nominal head of her enterprise while she secretly directed operations. In Cologne, women would form small cooperatives under innocuous names to continue weaving and trading. In France, educated women found refuge in convents, not just for spiritual fulfillment, but as safe spaces to pursue literacy, scholarship, and influence. These quiet forms of rebellion were crucial. They preserved methods, networks, and memories that would eventually seed new movements centuries later. Letters between mothers and daughters often contained coded instructions: how to manage property, negotiate contracts, and maintain authority in subtle ways that would not attract scrutiny. These weren't grand acts of defiance. They were survival strategies, ingenious, patient, and persistent. The psychological impact, however, was even deeper. For generations, women learned to distrust ambition in themselves. Confidence became dangerous to display publicly. Intellectual curiosity was tempered with humility. Desire for independence was cloaked in appearances of compliance. Mothers taught daughters that happiness was contingent on men, on marriage, patronage, or male approval. The internalization of fear became second nature. Women were no longer just threatened externally. They policed themselves, a phenomenon historians call self-surveillance. This period also saw the rise of the moral ideal of the virtuous woman. The attributes of industriousness, intelligence, and independence were not condemned outright anymore. They were quietly redirected into socially approved channels: caregiving, household management, and spiritual devotion. Women could excel, but only in ways that aligned with male-defined propriety. Ambition had to be invisible, or at least invisible to the wrong eyes. Wealth could be accumulated, but only if filtered through marriage, male oversight, or charitable institutions. And yet, the tension between suppression and resistance created fertile ground for subtle innovation. In towns across Europe, women formed hidden networks to continue what they had always done: exchange knowledge, manage finances, and support one another. These are the quiet successors to the guilds, the sisterhoods, and the medieval business networks that the witch hunters had tried to eradicate. Some were disguised as charitable organizations, convent affiliations, or literary circles. Others existed purely by word of mouth, where trust and secrecy were paramount. These networks allowed skills to survive. They preserved economic acumen, literacy, medical knowledge, and craft techniques that might otherwise have been lost. Remarkably, even the legal and economic systems could be bent creatively. Women learned loopholes. Widows would draft contracts that preserved autonomy under male trustees. Businesswomen would leverage male relatives' reputations while controlling operations themselves. Property could be placed in charitable trusts to shield it from marriage claims or confiscation. Even in an era designed to crush independence, women found ways to maintain it in small but meaningful measures. Culturally, the consequences of the witch hunts rippled through art, literature, and folklore. Fairy tales, plays, and poems began reflecting the new paradigm. Women's power was dangerous, independence was perilous, and fulfillment was found primarily through marriage. Stories that might once have celebrated female cleverness were now cautionary, filled with warnings about envy, seduction, or hubris. Even stories meant to entertain children often embedded moral lessons reinforcing compliance. Yet, just beneath the surface, memory of autonomy persisted. Scholars who examined surviving letters, diaries, and account books centuries later were astonished by the sophistication and resilience of women who lived and thrived despite systemic oppression. Hidden in plain sight were the records of women running businesses, managing estates, educating others, and mentoring protégés. These fragments told the story of a culture that tried, but never fully succeeded, in erasing female independence. This long shadow shaped Europe for centuries. By the 18th and 19th centuries, women's participation in public life was still constrained, but the knowledge of what had been possible endured in subtle ways. Families still passed down stories of capable aunts, widows, and grandmothers who had navigated impossible circumstances with ingenuity. Crafts, financial strategies, and educational methods were taught in secret or embedded in convent curricula. Communities retained traces of the networks that had survived the fires. And then, slowly, the groundwork laid by centuries of quiet resistance began to bear fruit. Enlightenment thinkers, often unaware of medieval precedents, began discussing women's capacity for reason, enterprise, and moral judgment. Early industrialization created new spaces for women to participate economically, often reviving old traditions of trade and craft. Social reformers drew on historical examples of independent women, citing widows, merchants, and abbesses as proof that women could wield power responsibly. By the time the 19th century arrived, the echoes of those medieval networks and strategies were faint but persistent. They had left an imprint on culture, on family structures, on education, and on economic practice. Even as the official narrative of female dependence dominated, hidden pockets of knowledge and practice preserved the blueprint of independence, waiting for a society ready to receive it. The lesson was unmistakable. You cannot completely erase resilience. You can burn records, shame individuals, and manipulate language. You can terrify a generation into compliance. But the skills, knowledge, and ambition that had been nurtured across centuries left an imprint too deep to destroy entirely. And that imprint, often invisible, quietly prepared the next waves of women to reclaim what had once been theirs. This slow, careful endurance is what allowed female autonomy to survive, even in an era designed to make it impossible. And it is why, when we look back at medieval Europe, we do not see a simple story of oppression. We see a long, painful struggle between forces seeking to suppress female independence and the women who refuse to let it die, quietly passing the torch, hidden, whispered, and fiercely preserved. By the dawn of the 17th century, Europe had shifted, but only subtly. The fires of the witch hunts had dimmed, yet the lessons they left behind remained deeply etched into collective consciousness. Women were cautious, yet the seeds of autonomy, long buried, had never truly been destroyed. They had survived in letters, in ledgers, in convent records, and in oral traditions passed down quietly from mother to daughter, aunt to niece, mentor to apprentice. These seeds were waiting for fertile ground to sprout once more, and the early modern period, with its slow urbanization, trade expansion, and intellectual ferment, provided in the bustling port cities of northern Italy. Women began quietly reclaiming spaces in commerce. Venice, which had long been a center of trade and culture, became a testing ground for new forms of female entrepreneurship. Here, widows of merchants who had once wielded power through inheritance continued to exercise authority, but now with a new edge. They innovated ways to expand family businesses without male intermediaries. Young women who had inherited skills from clandestine family workshops began to step forward as master artisans, opening shops under their own names. Some specialized in textiles, others in glass, others in fine metalwork. Their reputations, painstakingly built, became brands in themselves. The revival was not limited to Italy. In the Netherlands, cities like Amsterdam, Haarlem, and Utrecht became laboratories for female economic agency. Here, guild records reveal an uptick in independent women running workshops and small trading firms. Women traded textiles, spices, books, and imported luxury goods. Many were unmarried, others widowed, but all demonstrated an extraordinary combination of skill, vision, and cunning. Historical accounts describe these women negotiating contracts in multiple languages, managing ships and warehouses, and interacting directly with foreign buyers, skills that had been rare but never forgotten. They had learned the lessons of survival and discretion from generations of women before them. Meanwhile, education began to subtly shift. While universities were still officially closed to women, informal networks flourished. Convents continued to educate girls, not just in religious doctrine, but in mathematics, literacy, and finance, an inheritance from the abbesses of earlier centuries. Wealthy families often hired private tutors for daughters, emphasizing skills that would allow them to manage estates, trade, or family businesses. Women who had once been forced into invisibility in economic life were now quietly equipped with the tools to reclaim authority. Literacy, numeracy, and legal knowledge were no longer the exclusive domain of men that I in England. The revival took a slightly different form. London, Bristol, and Norwich, cities with long histories of female merchants, saw women gradually reasserting their presence in markets. Records from the merchant adventurers guilds indicate women acting as agents, running warehouses, negotiating contracts, and even lending capital. Though often still constrained by societal expectations, women leveraged familial connections, widowed status, and creative legal arrangements to gain autonomy. For instance, a widow might appoint a trusted nephew as the public face of her business while she retained full operational control, a strategy that echoed medieval precedents but was adapted for a changing legal landscape. The world of print culture, which expanded dramatically in the 17th century, provided another avenue for revival. Women began publishing under their own names, sometimes anonymously at first, but gradually openly, contributing to philosophy, poetry, religious discourse, and science. The intellectual networks that had been nurtured within convents now found expression in salons and literary societies. Women corresponded across cities and countries, sharing knowledge, debating ideas, and mentoring younger generations. The letters, journals, and publications from this period show women not just surviving, but thriving intellectually, often forming networks that would influence European thought for centuries. Business, however, remained the most tangible arena of female revival. Consider the example of a merchant widow in Antwerp named Helena Vandermeer. She inherited a modest textile workshop in 1623, and within a decade had expanded into an international operation, exporting to England, France, and Spain. She employed dozens of women and men, negotiated contracts in French and Dutch, and maintained a detailed accounting system that allowed her to reinvest profits strategically. Helena's success was not accidental. She had learned the principles of risk management, networking, and negotiation from her grandmother, a woman who had survived the turbulent late medieval period. Helena and her peers were rebuilding what had been almost lost, the blueprint for female economic power. The arts provided a parallel revival. In Florence, Paris, and Amsterdam, women patrons and creators emerged prominently. Women funded music, theater, architecture, and visual arts, often using their wealth to assert influence in civic and cultural life. Some, like Elizabeth Montagu in England, would later become famous in the 18th century for salon culture, but the roots were planted centuries earlier. These women were quietly shaping cultural taste, patronizing innovation, and creating intellectual spaces that encouraged female leadership in both thought and practice. Yet, this revival was not without tension. Society still carried centuries of embedded prejudice. Legal structures and social norms often constrained women's actions. Widows remained a privileged minority, and unmarried women faced persistent scrutiny. Economic and social networks often had to operate discreetly, and opportunities could be fragile. The shadow of the past lingered in the form of moral scrutiny, social policing, and the ever-present threat of reputational damage. Women had to navigate these dangers with skill, discretion, and creativity. Despite these obstacles, the revival of female independence had momentum. Skills, strategies, and networks once hidden or forbidden were resurfacing. Women began experimenting with new forms of enterprise, intellectual production, and social influence. The early modern period became a bridge connecting the radical autonomy of medieval abbesses, widows, and merchants to the more visible and assertive forms of female agency that would emerge in the 18th and 19th centuries. Education, commerce, and social networks combined to create what historians now recognize as a slow renaissance of female empowerment. Women applied lessons learned from centuries of survival. Diversification of income, strategic marriage decisions, discreet mentoring networks, careful public relations, and community support. Each small success built upon the memory of those who had preceded them. demonstrating that autonomy was not a novelty, but a historical right carefully preserved and nurtured. B. Why the late 17th century? The cumulative effect of this revival was undeniable. Independent women were increasingly visible in markets, workshops, intellectual circles, and even municipal governance in certain towns. While society still framed female power cautiously, and while remnants of fear and prejudice remained, the knowledge and practices of independence were no longer entirely lost. The strategies of medieval businesswomen, abbesses, and widows had been passed down, adapted, and improved upon, forming a hidden but resilient backbone for female autonomy. Through trade, education, and culture, women were quietly but definitively reclaiming their place in European life. They were rewriting the script, one subtle act at a time, showing that even centuries of suppression could not erase skill, intelligence, and determination. From Venice to London, Antwerp to Paris, the revival was taking hold. Women were reclaiming the right to earn, think, lead, and own, laying the foundations for a more visible and assertive empowerment that would unfold fully in the centuries to come. This was more than recovery. It was evolution. It was the merging of survival with innovation, memory with ambition, and inherited wisdom with new opportunities. Women were no longer just reacting to the constraints of society. They were actively reshaping the landscape, creating spaces where female power could not only survive, but thrive. By the mid-1600s, Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, principalities, and city-states, each with its own customs, laws, and levels of tolerance for female independence. The shadow of the witch hunts had begun to fade in some areas, but the psychological scars remained. Women walked carefully, balancing ambition with discretion, innovation with survival. And yet, those who had inherited the knowledge and strategies of their medieval predecessors were quietly transforming the everyday lives of their communities, sometimes imperceptibly, sometimes with profound impact. In smaller towns across Flanders, Brabant, and northern Germany, women were quietly consolidating power through trade, craft, and communal organization. Take the textile towns of Ghent and Bruges, for instance. While the guilds officially restricted female participation, records show women running entire workshops, coordinating shipments, negotiating prices with international merchants, and training younger apprentices. These were not isolated figures. They operated in cooperative networks. Widows who had inherited shops or warehouses shared resources with unmarried women, providing access to capital, labor, and markets that would have been otherwise impossible. These arrangements were often informal, deliberately flexible, and almost always overseen by women who had learned, over generations, the delicate art of survival within male-dominated structures. The rural countryside, too, was far from passive. Women in villages often controlled household economies, managing lands, livestock, and production. Peasant widows, left without male oversight, became de facto heads of estates. They decided which crops to plant, negotiated the terms of grain sales, and managed payments to laborers. Their influence extended beyond their households. Village courts frequently recognized their authority, particularly when their husbands had been merchants, craftsmen, or minor landowners. In some regions of northern Germany and the Low Countries, widows collectively acted as mediators and overseers, ensuring that trade continued smoothly in the absence of male heads. Their judgment was trusted precisely because it was proven over generations of necessity, and their networks became a backbone of regional commerce. The social strategies women used to maintain autonomy were equally sophisticated. Marriage was no longer an automatic route to security. It had become a choice weighed carefully against independence. Many women negotiated contracts that protected their property and earnings, insisting on retaining ownership and authority over workshops or lands. Widows often acted as intermediaries for younger women, drafting informal agreements to prevent exploitation. These were early examples of protective legal frameworks created entirely by women for women, operating quietly under the gaze of authorities who seldom fully understood or appreciated their sophistication. In cities such as Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen, urban women had developed a particularly ingenious form of collective influence. They organized rotating committees that oversaw guild apprenticeships, coordinated trade fairs, and even mediated disputes between male merchants. These committees were informal, unrecorded in official annals, yet their impact was profound. By pooling knowledge, resources, and networks, these women amplified their voices in an era when formal political participation was impossible. Their success relied on memory, oral tradition, and correspondence, letters that were meticulously copied and distributed among trusted circles. Through this invisible network, women shared pricing strategies, trade contacts, and legal precedents, ensuring that their businesses remained competitive and resilient. Education, though still limited, was subtly spreading in ways that reinforced autonomy. The daughters of widows or independent merchants were often trained in literacy, numeracy, and practical law. Convents continued to play a crucial role, offering structured education in towns and cities. Yet, unlike the medieval abbesses, these 17th century convents increasingly combined spiritual training with pragmatic skill building. Girls learned bookkeeping, estate management, and accounting alongside devotional studies. This combination produced women who could step seamlessly into roles as managers, merchants, and advisors. Even literacy itself became a tool of quiet empowerment. Women wrote letters, maintained ledgers, and created manuals of practice, often encoding strategies for independence in ways that could pass unnoticed by male authorities. Religion remained a double-edged sword. Publicly, women were expected to conform to moral ideals emphasizing obedience, chastity, and domesticity. Privately, religion offered both protection and opportunity. Prayer books, devotional literature, and convent networks provided not only spiritual guidance, but also practical wisdom. Some women used religious guise to justify their independence, framing economic and intellectual activity as a service to God. Others subtly challenged male authority by occupying roles that society deemed appropriate: midwifery, charitable oversight, or convent administration. But performed these roles with efficiency and scope that rivaled secular men in power and influence. In certain towns, women began experimenting with long-term economic security in ways reminiscent of medieval strategies. Dowry systems were transformed into protective instruments. Young women retained portions of their inheritances under formal agreements, allowing them to maintain some control if widowed or unmarried. Joint ventures between widows and unmarried women grew increasingly common, pooling financial and labor resources to protect against market fluctuations or predatory male merchants. These early collaborations were remarkably sophisticated. They included rules for shared profits, apprenticeships, dispute resolution, and succession planning. The careful record-keeping required for these ventures produced detailed ledgers that modern historians are only now beginning to fully decode, revealing the scale and complexity of female-managed enterprise. The physical presence of women in towns and markets also evolved strategically. Women who managed businesses often lived adjacent to their workshops, carefully structuring their homes to accommodate both private life and commercial activity. Some maintained small storefronts at street level with living quarters above, allowing them to monitor trade and apprentices while preserving a measure of personal space. Others rented rooms in inns or communal residences, creating networks that connected traders, artisans, and investors in a way that extended beyond familial ties. In all cases, women optimized the use of space, time, and relationships to create spheres of autonomy that were simultaneously visible and secure. Even in male-dominated legal systems, women discovered avenues to safeguard and leverage their autonomy. Notaries, local judges, and clerks often relied on women to act as mediators, guarantors, or witnesses for transactions. Widows with business experience were trusted to oversee contracts or manage estates, occasionally negotiating on behalf of male relatives or even civic authorities. The legal frameworks were imperfect and inconsistent, but women turned every loophole, precedent, and informal custom to their advantage. Their success was rarely absolute. It required careful navigation, discretion, and relentless attention to social dynamics. Yet the fact that these strategies existed and were widely adopted shows that female autonomy had become a structural reality, even if unofficial and fragile. The sheer scale of these informal networks is striking. From the Low Countries to northern Germany, from Flanders to the Rhineland, thousands of women were operating in cooperative, mutually reinforcing systems. They shared apprentices, pooled capital, distributed knowledge about markets and prices, and collectively resisted attempts to undermine their independence. These networks were not celebrated in contemporary chronicles, but they were integral to the functioning of local and regional economies. Merchants, millers, dyers, and artisans all relied on the stability, reliability, and skill of these women. In many cases, towns thrived precisely because of female participation in commerce and civic life, a fact rarely acknowledged in official histories. And yet, despite the practical success of these networks, women remained acutely aware of the dangers they faced. Legal authorities, guilds, and moralists could still impose restrictions, levy fines, or attempt to subsume their property through coercion. Social policing, gossip, and moral scrutiny remained constant threats. In response, women developed sophisticated strategies of invisibility and discretion. Some created shadow businesses, conducting major operations under the names of male relatives or trusted allies, while retaining control behind the scenes. Others relied on reputation and patronage to protect their ventures, cultivating allies among influential men and respected peers who would defend their interests if challenged. Survival required cunning, patience, and foresight. That be why the late 1600s. The pattern was clear. Centuries of knowledge, experience, and resilience had not been extinguished. Women had rebuilt systems of autonomy, commerce, and education that allowed them to survive and thrive in a world still largely designed to constrain them. These systems were not revolutionary in the sense of open rebellion. They were evolutionary, gradual, and deeply pragmatic. They were built on the foundation laid by medieval abbesses, widows, and independent businesswomen, and they ensured that the lessons of autonomy, self-sufficiency, and strategic collaboration persisted across generations. This period demonstrates something remarkable. Even in a pre-modern, pre-industrial world dominated by patriarchal norms, women had found ways to exercise agency, create wealth, and influence communities. They were not yet fully recognized in formal histories, but their impact was real, tangible, and enduring. Through commerce, education, social networks, and legal acumen, women maintained spheres of power that could survive economic shocks, social scrutiny, and political instability. Their resilience would quietly lay the groundwork for future generations, preserving knowledge of autonomy that would resurface in subsequent centuries. Even in small villages, quiet cities, and cloistered convents, the principles of survival, collaboration, and self-determination endured. These women were the invisible architects of their own worlds, crafting lives of practical independence long before modern movements could codify the idea of female empowerment. In every ledger, letter, and contract, their legacy persisted, a careful, deliberate, and profoundly human assertion that women could thrive on their own terms, even within a society designed to limit them. By the early 1700s, Europe was a continent in quiet transformation. The wars of the 17th century had reshaped borders, drained treasuries, and left social systems unsettled, but commerce continued to expand. Towns and cities were becoming denser, and trade networks extended from inland markets to distant ports. For women who had inherited the lessons of the previous century, this environment offered both danger and opportunity. Those who had once operated in small-town guild workshops or village markets were now able to engage in broader networks, linking urban centers with rural hinterlands, and even connecting with emerging colonial economies through trade in textiles, spices, and precious metals. Yet the world remained pre-industrial. Ships relied on wind. Goods traveled slowly by cart or river, and letters could take weeks or months to arrive. The pace of life demanded patience. careful calculation, and memory, qualities women had long mastered in port cities such as Amsterdam, Antwerp, and Hamburg. Widows of merchants and shipowners were consolidating control over complex commercial operations. Unlike their predecessors, these women were not simply preserving inherited businesses, they were expanding them. Ledgers from the period show women supervising fleets of cargo ships, negotiating long-distance contracts, and coordinating multiple workshops producing cloth, leather goods, and household items. They understood credit, interest, and risk, and they meticulously managed logistics that spanned rivers, canals, and seas. Partnerships were often built with other women, sometimes in distant cities, linked by letters that carefully disguised the financial and strategic knowledge contained within. These letters were written in clear, precise hand, yet often coded or indirect in tone to prevent unscrupulous men from intercepting profitable knowledge. The strategies women employed were often subtle, but ingeniously effective. In addition to running businesses, many widows and unmarried women became patrons and intermediaries in local trade, acting as guarantors for younger merchants, mediators in disputes, and overseers of apprenticeships. These roles allowed them to extend influence without overtly challenging male authority, creating a social and economic leverage that was both safe and profound. In some towns, women collectively formed networks resembling proto-banking systems, pooling capital to fund ventures, offering short-term credit to trusted buyers, and sharing intelligence on markets and commodities. These networks were carefully maintained, often relying on secrecy and trust, and they enabled women to exercise influence that was socially invisible yet economically powerful. Education continued to grow in importance. While literacy and numeracy were still rare for most women, daughters of merchants, widows, and minor nobility were increasingly trained in bookkeeping, languages, geography, and legal practice. Convents and private tutors provided instruction that combined moral guidance with practical skills, preparing women to manage estates, negotiate contracts, and navigate commercial networks. Some even kept travel diaries or account books, recording knowledge that was both personal and functional. The careful cultivation of these skills allowed women to participate in transactions, correspond with distant partners, and monitor markets, activities that remained largely invisible to male authorities but had tangible consequences for the regional economy. Rural areas continued to provide opportunities for women to assert autonomy. In villages, widows and unmarried women managed farms, oversaw harvests, and organized communal labor. They collected rents, supervised craftsmen, and coordinated local trade. These women were often the most reliable guarantors of community stability, and their authority was recognized in informal courts and councils, even when male-dominated legal systems theoretically limited their rights. Some women maintained small workshops producing textiles, candles, or beer, supplying urban markets with goods while remaining embedded in their local communities. Their expertise in production, logistics, and negotiation made them essential participants in local economies, even if their influence remained largely undocumented. Religious life continued to shape the ways women exercised agency. Convents, charitable organizations, and guild-sanctioned religious roles provided legitimate cover for women's activities. Midwifery, for example, combined spiritual and practical authority. Midwives oversaw childbirth, administered herbal remedies, and sometimes acted as trusted advisors or negotiators in family and business matters. The moral legitimacy of religious and charitable work allowed women to expand influence into areas that might otherwise be restricted, and many strategically used their positions to gather intelligence, support apprentices, and facilitate trade. Colonial trade subtly transformed opportunities for women. The expanding networks connecting Europe with the Caribbean, Africa, and the Americas created new demands for textiles, household goods, and provisioning. Widows and unmarried women in port towns sometimes acted as intermediaries, arranging shipments, negotiating contracts, and coordinating payments. They could also participate indirectly in the early global commodity trade, sugar, coffee, spices, and cotton, without leaving their home cities. The complexity of these operations required careful record-keeping, trust, and patience, skills that women had been refining for generations. Even when their names did not appear on formal contracts, their decisions shaped the flow of goods, the stability of markets, and the fortunes of merchant families. Marriage remained a strategic consideration. Women increasingly negotiated contracts that protected property, secured dowries, and preserved control over businesses. Widows used their experience to mentor younger women, helping them navigate marital agreements and maintain independence. This mentorship extended beyond family ties. Networks of women shared practical advice on trade, property law, household management, and negotiation strategies. These informal systems were remarkably resilient, transmitting knowledge across generations and ensuring that women retained a degree of autonomy, even in highly patriarchal societies. Even the physical organization of urban space was leveraged to maintain autonomy. Women structured homes and workshops to maximize efficiency, visibility, and control. Some operated small storefronts or warehouses with living quarters above, while others managed shared lodgings that connected multiple women in cooperative enterprises. Courtyards, hidden passages, and side rooms were carefully used to manage apprentices, store goods, and conduct business discreetly. These architectural strategies complemented economic and social networks, creating spheres of influence that were both tangible and socially acceptable. Despite these advances, women still faced constant threats. Male guilds, legal authorities, and moral enforcers remained vigilant, ready to limit, tax, or co-opt female enterprise. Social surveillance, gossip, and religious censure were persistent dangers. Women mitigated these risks through discretion, alliances, and careful cultivation of reputation. Some maintained nominal male oversight in public, while retaining de facto control behind the scenes. Others relied on patronage, building relationships with influential men who could shield them from interference. Survival depended on patience, observation, and the ability to act decisively when opportunities arose. WY mid-century. The cumulative effect of these strategies was profound. Women had created enduring networks that combined commerce, education, legal savvy, and social influence. They were integral to the functioning of both urban and rural economies, controlling production, trade, and resources in ways that were often invisible to official records. Their networks were diverse and adaptable, capable of surviving economic crises, political instability, and social scrutiny. Even as Europe edged closer to the industrial age, these women remained firmly grounded in a pre-modern world. Their strategies relied on memory, skill, relationships, and the careful observation of social norms. They did not challenge the system openly. Instead, they navigated it with subtlety, intelligence, and resilience. Through careful collaboration, mentorship, and the preservation of knowledge, women in the early 18th century ensured that their autonomy, influence, and practical expertise would survive and flourish in the centuries to come. Their legacy was one of quiet, persistent power. In workshops, farms, markets, and convents, women were both the invisible hands and the guiding minds behind the economy and social structure. Each ledger, letter, and apprenticeship record was a testament to ingenuity, resilience, and foresight. Though the world around them was slow, hierarchical, and fraught with peril, women had mastered the art of survival, building structures of autonomy that would continue to shape society long before formal recognition ever arrived. By the middle of the 18th century, Europe was a continent of bustling cities, winding canals, and crowded marketplaces, yet remained fundamentally pre-industrial. Roads were rough and treacherous, rivers were primary highways, and communication across even short distances could take days or weeks. In this environment, the lives of independent women, widows, unmarried merchants, convent leaders, and heads of rural households required ingenuity, patience, and a keen sense of social and economic opportunity. Unlike the more visible power of abbesses or urban widows of the previous century, many women in this era wielded influence in subtle, carefully managed ways, shaping trade, education, and society from behind the curtain of patriarchal expectation. Port cities had grown larger and more interconnected than ever. Antwerp, Marseille, and Hamburg were now hubs for regional trade, linking not only inland Europe, but also the expanding colonial enterprises in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Within these cities, widows of merchants and craftswomen managed complex businesses, overseeing multiple workshops, fleets of carts, and networks of apprentices. These women were masters of logistics. A single trading shipment might involve coordinating the weaving of cloth in one district, dyeing in another, arranging transport by barge to a distant port, and negotiating sales with agents who might be days or weeks away. Each step required careful calculation, the management of human resources, and an extraordinary memory, for most transactions were still handled without formal documentation or only through meticulously maintained ledgers. Widows remained the principal beneficiaries of legal structures that allowed them to inherit property and conduct business independently. Yet they had to navigate a society increasingly obsessed with the public appearance of female propriety. Unlike in previous centuries, when women might quietly command workshops or estates, the 18th century demanded subtlety. Women learned to operate in plain sight while masking the full extent of their power. Apprenticeships, guild permissions, and contracts were often arranged under the guise of male oversight or communal supervision, while the true decision-making rested in female hands. Letters from widows of merchants in Bordeaux and Lisbon reveal careful phrasing. Each document provides guidance and commands without ever appearing confrontational or overstepping social norms. The language was precise, indirect, and strategic, ensuring obedience while avoiding scrutiny. Trade remained a central avenue for influence. Women continued to dominate sectors traditionally associated with their gender: textiles, foodstuffs, brewing, but they also expanded into areas previously dominated by men. Some oversaw the production of fine glass, ceramics, or metalwork, coordinating supply chains that stretched across multiple cities. Others became intermediaries in commodity trade, connecting inland markets with seaports and arranging exchanges for sugar, coffee, and spices. These networks required meticulous calculation. Shipping delays, spoilage, and theft were constant risks, and women had to anticipate these challenges in advance. They trained apprentices not just in production, but also in risk management, correspondence, and negotiation. Education, although still limited, became increasingly central to women's strategies of influence. In cities like Paris, Vienna, and Amsterdam, daughters of merchants and minor nobility received instruction in mathematics, bookkeeping, foreign languages, and law, ensuring that they could continue family businesses or manage inherited estates. Convents remained vital centers for education, but private tutors and informal study circles also proliferated. Some women even maintained libraries in their homes, often coded in a way that allowed only trusted individuals to access knowledge of trade secrets, medicinal remedies, or legal precedents. These libraries were living repositories of female autonomy, where information and strategy were preserved and transmitted from generation to generation. Religious life continued to provide both opportunity and protection. Convents offered leadership roles for women that combined moral authority, economic power, and intellectual freedom. Abbesses managed estates, collected rents, administered hospitals, and maintained workshops. Many convents operated printing presses or scriptoriums, producing manuscripts and records that were both educational and practical. In some regions, these institutions became economic engines in their own right, producing textiles, books, and medicinal products. The abbesses' ability to operate across secular and religious domains gave them unique leverage. They could engage in trade, fund charitable projects, and exercise social influence without attracting the same scrutiny faced by secular women. Rural areas remained equally important. Villages and smaller towns relied on widows and unmarried women to manage farms, oversee production, and maintain local trade networks. These women organized labor cooperatives, supervised harvests, and coordinated the transport of goods to market. They mediated disputes, advised younger women, and sometimes held informal authority in community councils. Their work was essential for local economies, yet it often went unrecorded in formal documents. Archaeological studies and regional archives reveal that these women's labor and decision-making underpinned the broader economy, ensuring food supply, managing livestock, and sustaining craft production across Europe. Community networks were a hallmark of female strategy in this era. Women organized mutual aid systems, sharing resources, knowledge, and labor. Apprenticeships and training programs often moved from one workshop to another under female supervision, ensuring that knowledge and skills were preserved and expanded. Networks extended across cities and regions, linking mothers, daughters, widows, and unmarried merchants. They exchanged information about market conditions, legal challenges, and opportunities for expansion. These informal but highly effective systems allowed women to collectively navigate economic and social constraints while minimizing risk. Marriage and property law continued to shape strategic choices. Women negotiated marriage contracts with extreme care, protecting property, securing dowries, and preserving control over their businesses. Widows often acted as advisors for younger women entering marriage or planning independent ventures, passing down practical wisdom about law, negotiation, and social navigation. These strategies ensured continuity of female autonomy across generations, even as legal systems remained patriarchal. The physical organization of homes and workshops reflected these strategies. Urban workshops often combined living quarters, storage, and production spaces, carefully designed for efficiency and privacy. Courtyards and hidden rooms facilitated training, storage, and discreet negotiations. Rural homes and estates were similarly organized, balancing agricultural production, craftwork, and domestic life. These spaces reinforced autonomy, allowing women to manage enterprises effectively without inviting interference. Even as opportunities expanded, risks remained constant. Male guilds, religious authorities, and local officials monitored women's activity, often attempting to limit their influence. Reputation was vital. A single accusation of impropriety could threaten a woman's position. Women mitigated these dangers through careful alliances, patronage networks, and strategic compliance with social expectations. By combining discretion with competence, they created spheres of influence that were socially permissible yet economically potent. By the late 18th century, the cumulative effect of these strategies was remarkable. Women were integral to both urban and rural economies, controlling production, trade, and capital in ways often invisible to official authorities. They shaped apprenticeship systems, financial arrangements, and trade networks, creating enduring structures of knowledge, influence, and autonomy. Even in a world of slow communication, pre-industrial logistics, and rigid social hierarchies, women exercised agency and power through patience, intelligence, and the careful management of networks. Across Europe, these women, widows, unmarried merchants, convent leaders, and rural matriarchs, had created resilient systems of autonomy. They combined education, social intelligence, and economic acumen to survive and thrive in a pre-modern world. Their lives were defined not by overt rebellion, but by subtle mastery, the ability to influence, negotiate, and expand power within the constraints of a society that officially sought to limit them. They preserved knowledge, transmitted skills, and maintained networks that would survive even the upheavals of war, plague, and shifting political structures. In this period, women's autonomy was less visible, but no less significant than the more conspicuous power of abbesses or wealthy widows in port cities. Their strategies relied on skill, subtlety, and careful observation, allowing them to operate in a pre-industrial world without relying on modern political or technological frameworks. Each letter, ledger, apprenticeship record, and household arrangement was a testament to ingenuity, resilience, and foresight. The networks they created were living, dynamic, and adaptable, safeguards for autonomy that would echo into the future long before formal recognition of women's rights. By the late 18th century, European towns and cities were alive with movement. wagons rattling along cobblestone streets, barges gliding along canals carrying grain, wine, and textiles, and the smell of tanneries, bakeries, and dye works filling the air. Within this bustling pre-industrial world, women, widows, unmarried merchants, and craftswomen had carved spaces of influence that were at once subtle and extraordinary. These were not public offices or parliamentary seats, which remained firmly the domain of men. Instead, their power operated through careful negotiation, meticulous record-keeping, and the management of production networks that spanned entire regions in port cities like Hamburg and Marseille. Widows of merchants controlled entire fleets of small river barges and coastal vessels. Each vessel carried carefully cataloged cargo: fine linens from Lyon, spices from Lisbon, salted fish from the North Sea, or casks of wine for Bordeaux. These women understood the rhythm of markets with uncanny precision. They knew when to purchase, when to sell, and when to wait for better prices. Their warehouses were managed with extraordinary attention to detail. Goods were inspected for quality, recorded in ledgers, and stored so that spoilage was minimized. Apprentices, often younger women, were trained to manage these warehouses, ensuring that knowledge of trade and logistics could pass from one generation to the next. In the interior towns, women dominated artisanal production in ways that shaped regional economies. Textile production, still largely home-based, required the coordination of spinning, weaving, dyeing, and finishing. Widows or unmarried women often supervised entire villages, distributing raw wool or flax to households, collecting finished cloth, and negotiating sales at market fairs. Their networks extended across dozens of towns, ensuring a consistent supply of goods and maintaining high standards of quality. Contracts with merchants and brokers were carefully worded, and payments were often made in installments to reduce risk. Women acted as financiers, intermediaries, and managers simultaneously, combining skills that would be recognized today as the hallmarks of executive leadership. These networks were reinforced by social strategy. Women established mutual aid arrangements, lending money to each other for ventures or emergencies, providing shelter and care for the sick, and arranging apprenticeships for orphans or children of widows. In rural regions, widows often mediated disputes among tenants or neighbors, and their counsel was sought on legal matters ranging from property inheritance to local trade regulations. By cultivating these alliances, women created spheres of influence that extended far beyond their immediate households. Their authority was subtle but pervasive. Even local magistrates and guild officials deferred to their judgment, knowing that attempting to challenge them could disrupt trade or social stability. Education was a cornerstone of independence. While formal schooling for girls remained rare, women's literacy rates in urban centers were notably higher than the countryside, and widows often ensured that their daughters or female apprentices could read, write, and manage accounts. Some maintained extensive personal libraries, carefully cataloged in ledgers, containing not only merchant records, but also legal treatises, practical manuals on dyeing, medicine, and weaving, and collections of letters from other women across Europe. These libraries functioned as centers of practical knowledge and strategy, ensuring continuity in business operations and offering intellectual stimulation in a society that often restricted women's formal education. Religious institutions continued to play a critical role. Convents offered opportunities for women to wield extraordinary power within the framework of piety. Abbesses managed vast estates, collected rents, oversaw craft workshops, and even engaged in diplomacy. Some convents maintained workshops producing cloth, medicinal preparations, and illuminated manuscripts, which were sold to support both charitable work and institutional stability. Abbesses coordinated networks of correspondence, effectively operating multi-node communication systems, where intelligence about trade, politics, and legal precedent could be transmitted across hundreds of miles. Within convent walls, women were free to pursue scholarship, intellectual discourse, and artistic creation without the scrutiny faced by secular women, giving them a rare domain of authority and influence. Marriage, inheritance, and property law remained central to strategy. Widows, having inherited estates or businesses, were often approached with marriage proposals. Yet the careful management of property and wealth frequently led them to refuse these offers, preserving autonomy and control. Contracts were meticulously written to ensure that property could not be transferred without consent. Some widows served as advisors for younger women, guiding them through marriage negotiations, dowry arrangements, and legal documentation to secure independence or favorable positions. These strategies were rooted not in ideology, but in practical necessity. Survival and influence depended on foresight and careful planning. Daily life for these women combined the domestic, the economic, and the strategic. Urban homes frequently integrated living quarters with workshops, storage rooms, and spaces for apprenticeship training. Rural estates combined agricultural production with craftwork, animal husbandry, and trade coordination. Kitchens became centers of both sustenance and administration. While stews simmered in large cauldrons, ledgers were examined, apprentices were trained, and correspondence with distant merchants was carefully composed. Even small choices, how to arrange furniture, how to schedule work and rest, reflected a sophisticated understanding of efficiency, control, and autonomy. Risk management was constant. Guilds often resisted female participation, enforcing rules that constrained women's access to certain trades or markets. Local officials could challenge property ownership, and neighbors might attempt to assert authority in disputes. Successful women countered these threats with alliances, careful negotiation, and adherence to social conventions. They became masters of persuasion, capable of asserting authority without confrontation, leveraging social networks to reinforce their position, and using reputation as a shield against legal and economic challenges. Communication remained slow but vital. Letters, often carried by itinerant merchants or local couriers, contained detailed instructions, market intelligence, and guidance for apprentices or correspondents. Women developed codes and shorthand to protect sensitive information, and they maintained meticulous records to ensure accountability and continuity. Even a minor mistake, miscounting goods, failing to note a shipment, could have cascading effects across the network, and women demonstrated extraordinary precision in maintaining these systems over years and even decades. Despite societal constraints, women wielded considerable influence. Markets, local economies, and trade networks often depended on their expertise. Widows' management of estates and businesses sustained urban centers, regulated rural production, and facilitated long-distance commerce. Their apprenticeship networks ensured the transmission of skills and knowledge, while their mutual aid systems provided security and support that official institutions rarely offered. Women's influence was woven into the fabric of daily life, shaping economies, communities, and social hierarchies in ways that official histories largely ignored. Health and longevity were also deeply intertwined with independence. Women who managed their households, controlled their labor, and participated in economic life often lived longer than those subjected to repeated pregnancies, forced marriages, or the physical strain of male-dominated labor. Convents and urban networks provided additional support structures, including medical knowledge, access to skilled healers, and cooperative care during illness. These practices contributed not only to survival, but also to sustained economic and social influence that by the end of the 18th century, Europe's landscape of female autonomy was both robust and fragile. Women had established networks of trade, education, and social influence that were sophisticated, resilient, and far-reaching. Yet these networks relied on constant vigilance, discretion, and adaptation to shifting political, legal, and social conditions. The strategies these women developed, careful negotiation, apprenticeship networks, subtle alliances, and meticulous record-keeping, allowed them to survive and thrive in a pre-modern world that offered few protections and many constraints in cities and villages alike. Women had transformed economic, social, and intellectual life. Their contributions were visible in bustling markets, well-managed estates, efficient workshops, and thriving communities. Through strategic acumen, careful observation, and relentless determination, They had created autonomy within the strictures of a pre-industrial, patriarchal society. Their networks of knowledge, commerce, and mutual aid would endure, quietly influencing future generations even as societal structures threatened to contain or erase their achievements. The world in which these women lived was entirely pre-modern. Rivers and roads were their highways, letters and couriers their communication, apprentices their labor force, and markets their arenas of influence. Their power was subtle, dispersed, and relational, rooted in the practicalities of everyday life rather than formal institutions or modern political systems. Yet within these constraints, they demonstrated extraordinary ingenuity, resilience, and foresight, proving that women could shape economies, communities, and knowledge even without the privileges or frameworks that later centuries would introduce by the early 18th century. The rhythm of European towns had settled into a kind of quiet intensity, where trade, craft, and social life moved at a deliberate pace, guided by the slow passing of seasons rather than the artificial urgency of clocks or industrial schedules. Within this world, women who had long cultivated independence in commerce now found their authority extending into spheres far beyond mere transactions. Their influence was no longer limited to the counting of coins, the arranging of shipments, or the careful supervision of workshops. It began to ripple outward, touching the very structures of daily life, governance, and community that in small towns across the Low Countries. Widows and unmarried merchants often acted as informal mediators in disputes between neighbors, resolving conflicts over land boundaries, grazing rights, or trade disagreements. Their authority came not from law alone, but from reputation. Decades of fair dealing, precise bookkeeping, and careful negotiation had made them figures whose judgment could be trusted. Villagers, artisans, and even minor officials would defer to their counsel, knowing that a solution sanctioned by these women carried the weight of experience and social legitimacy. It was a subtle power, one woven into the everyday functioning of society. It was power nonetheless. Markets continue to serve as the central stage for female influence. The weekly gatherings of vendors, merchants, and townsfolk were alive with a measured bustle. Wooden carts creaking, the aroma of fresh bread mingling with the scents of herbs and spices, coins clinking as goods changed hands. Women moved through these markets with quiet authority, inspecting wares, negotiating prices, and arranging shipments for distant towns. Apprentices and younger relatives scurried at their sides, learning not only the technical aspects of trade, but the subtler arts of observation, judgment, and persuasion. Here, independence was taught as a practice, a lived skill, as much as an inherited privilege. In towns near rivers or canals, women controlled networks of supply that stretched across dozens of settlements. From grain grown in the fertile river valleys to textiles dyed in vibrant colors from imported plant materials, the flow of goods relied on meticulous timing, reliable transport, and careful record-keeping. Women oversaw barges loaded with merchandise, sometimes traveling alongside crews to ensure contracts were fulfilled. Letters and notes exchanged with distant partners were copied and recopied, bearing detailed instructions that could make or break fortunes. The labor was exacting, but the women undertook it with a calm confidence that spoke to decades of experience and careful planning. Yet their influence extended beyond economics. Women acted as patrons of local artisans, commissioning works of embroidery, sculpture, and illuminated manuscripts. In towns where literacy was rising slowly, women organized reading circles and informal schools, teaching younger girls arithmetic, sewing, and the rudiments of literacy. These gatherings often took place in modest homes or communal halls, but the effect was profound. Knowledge spread quietly, steadily, and without fanfare, creating a web of practical education that shaped the next generation. Even religion was touched by this quiet expansion of female authority. While convents continued to offer centers of concentrated power for abbesses and nuns, independent women in towns cultivated relationships with parish priests, local clergy, and spiritual advisors. They donated to the maintenance of chapels, provided support for charitable works, and sometimes mediated disputes within the congregation itself. Their piety was not performative. It was practical, tied to the functioning of communities, and deeply integrated with daily life. In doing so, women could operate within the accepted social framework while extending influence across multiple domains. The management of estates and households remained a core aspect of this autonomy. Kitchens, storerooms, and barns were organized with precision. Seasonal cycles dictated planting, harvest, and storage, but within those rhythms, women exercised judgment over labor, distribution, and allocation of resources. Younger family members and apprentices learned the art of observation, how to detect early signs of spoilage, how to anticipate market needs, how to negotiate agreements with laborers or tenants. Management here was less a matter of authority imposed from above than of careful orchestration, aligning resources, labor, and social ties into a functioning, resilient network. Across towns and villages, women cultivated social capital with equal care. Weddings, baptisms, funerals, and seasonal fairs offered opportunities for networking. Every interaction was a moment to observe, to advise, and sometimes to guide decisions about trade, property, or alliances. Letters were written with precision, addressed not only to family members, but to merchants, neighbors, and even officials, carrying information, requests, or subtle counsel. A carefully phrased note could prevent disputes, secure favorable terms, or ensure the long-term stability of a business or household. In these letters, one sees a remarkable combination of tact, foresight, and quiet authority. Artisanships were often interwoven with these social networks. Women oversaw spinning, weaving, dyeing, and tailoring, not merely for profit, but as means of sustaining communities. They coordinated raw materials, ensured quality, and maintained relations with buyers across rivers, roads, and regional fairs. The skill and patience required for these operations created a rhythm of work that, while demanding, allowed space for observation, teaching, and mentoring. Apprentices under these women learned not just the craft, but the habits of attention, negotiation, and endurance that ensured both economic and social survival. Trade fairs were particularly vital. Held seasonally in towns across Northern Europe, fairs brought together merchants from dozens of cities, providing opportunities to expand networks, secure rare materials, and negotiate long-distance contracts. Women attending these fairs moved with authority, often leading caravans of apprentices and goods, securing lodging, and negotiating sales directly. Their presence was accepted not only because of experience, but because men recognized the reliability and skill these women brought. They were masters of timing, quality control, and long-distance communication, all without the written contracts or legal protections that would characterize later commercial law. The day-to-day life of these women blended labor, supervision, social mediation, and mentorship. A morning might begin with inspecting workshops, adjusting production schedules, and reviewing ledgers. By mid-morning, correspondents might arrive from distant towns, requiring careful decisions about shipments, credit, or partnerships. Afternoons were spent in negotiation, apprenticeship training, or attending markets. Evenings could include study, reflection, or informal gatherings for instruction and community building. Time, while measured by natural cycles rather than clocks, was managed with an almost mathematical precision, each action considered for its effect on household, trade, and social network. Yet even with this careful orchestration, life remained fragile. Weather could ruin crops, roads could flood, and shipments could be lost to theft or accident. Women responded with adaptability, shifting resources, redirecting shipments, and relying on trusted correspondents. Their networks of apprentices, friends, and fellow widows created a safety net, a web of interdependence that was both practical and resilient. Survival, prosperity, and influence depended on skill, observation, and judgment rather than brute force or formal authority. IT is in this slow, deliberate rhythm of pre-industrial life that the strength and subtlety of female influence becomes visible. Across towns, villages, and small cities, women shaped the economy, mediated society, and preserved knowledge with a quiet, steady authority that required neither modern technology nor industrialized systems. Their power was relational, practical, and deeply embedded in the daily ebb and flow of life. In the counting of coins, the arranging of goods, the training of apprentices, the negotiation of alliances, and the meticulous observation of natural and human patterns, as twilight descended over canals and cobblestones, the work of these women continued quietly. Fires glowed in kitchens and workshops, candles illuminated ledgers and letters, and the hum of life, the measured rhythm of labor, negotiation, and learning, persisted. There was no grand fanfare, no proclamations in print or court. Their authority was earned, lived, and maintained through decades of careful attention and steady effort. And though the world outside remained dominated by men, with laws, customs, and expectations designed to contain female agency, these women had created spheres of influence where skill, judgment, and experience mattered more than titles, votes, or patriarchal approval. As the decades passed, the influence of these independent women began to stretch far beyond the walls of a single town or city. Their networks, originally local and grounded in immediate trade and household concerns, began to intertwine across regions, forming a lattice of influence that linked riverside towns, market hubs, and provincial villages. This was a slow, deliberate expansion, a weaving together of relationships that relied on trust, reputation, and the careful management of information, rather than the speed or scale of armies or official edicts. By the late 17th century, it was common for widows and unmarried merchants in one city to maintain regular correspondence with peers dozens, sometimes hundreds, of miles away. Letters carried more than instructions about shipments or payments. They conveyed warnings about political tensions, tips on market fluctuations, and observations about the behavior of traders and local officials. These communications were painstakingly copied by scribes or apprentices, often carried by trusted messengers who could navigate the shifting loyalties and dangers of rural roads. A single letter might take weeks to reach its destination, but the women understood the rhythm of these exchanges, planning months in advance, adjusting their expectations to the slow pulse of travel and information. Trade routes became arteries not just of goods, but of knowledge and influence. Rivers and canals, the lifeblood of towns from Bruges to Cologne, carried not only textiles, grain, and spices, but also stories, news, and strategic intelligence. Women coordinated the movement of these goods with astonishing precision. They knew which barges were reliable, which captains could be trusted with precious cargo, and which towns were likely to impose additional tolls or taxes. Their influence ensured that goods moved smoothly, that payments were collected promptly, and that apprentices and agents were positioned to respond to sudden changes. In doing so, they were quietly shaping regional economies, controlling supply chains that spanned dozens of settlements. But these networks were about more than commerce. They fostered cultural exchange and social cohesion across towns and regions. Women coordinated festivals, fairs, and gatherings that allowed artisans, merchants, and scholars to meet, learn, and exchange ideas. Through these events, embroidery patterns, weaving techniques, herbal remedies, and educational methods spread with remarkable efficiency. Recipes for dyes, for bread, for textiles, even for medicines, passed along these networks, creating a shared cultural and practical knowledge that transcended any single town. Apprentices traveling between towns brought back both skills and stories, strengthening the bonds of trust and mutual aid between distant communities. Education became a quiet pillar of this influence. Women in towns where literacy was rising organized reading groups, informal schools, and private lessons for younger girls, ensuring that practical knowledge of trade, bookkeeping, and household management was passed down carefully. Some letters revealed detailed instructions on arithmetic and measurement, not as abstract knowledge, but as applied skills necessary to manage workshops, oversee shipments, and negotiate fair agreements. Knowledge became both a currency and a shield, allowing women to maintain independence even in a world designed to favor male authority. religious life, too, remained intertwined with these networks. While abbeys and convents continued to offer concentrated centers of female power, women outside these walls cultivated relationships with local priests and clergy. They funded chapels, provided for charitable works, and mediated conflicts within their parishes. These connections ensured a form of social legitimacy, allowing women to navigate potential criticism while exercising real influence over both spiritual and civic matters. In many towns, widows and unmarried merchants were quietly recognized as arbiters whose counsel could prevent disputes from escalating into legal battles or feuds. The management of estates and households remained central to their authority, but it was executed with increasing sophistication. Kitchens, storerooms, barns, and workshops were organized with careful attention to efficiency and sustainability. Seasonal rhythms, planting, harvest, storage, and trade were mapped and monitored with a precision that allowed for both prosperity and resilience. Women trained apprentices and younger family members not only in craft and trade, but in judgment, observation, and planning. Each small decision, from the storage of grain to the timing of shipment, was part of a larger tapestry of foresight and strategy. Markets remained their primary stage, alive with the measured clatter of commerce. Carts creaking over cobblestones, the scent of bread mingling with that of spices and herbs, coins shifting hands in the sunlit square. Women moved through this space with a calm authority, inspecting wares, evaluating the quality of goods, and negotiating sales. They were adept at reading the flow of the market, understanding not only price but quality, scarcity, and reputation. Apprentices watched closely, learning how subtle observation could yield far greater returns than force or loud argument. Why coordinating across towns, women began to exert influence over regional trade patterns. They controlled the movement of essential commodities like wool, grain, and textiles, deciding which towns received priority, which goods were stored for later seasons, and which were sent to fairs far downstream. They coordinated with distant partners to anticipate shortages or surpluses, effectively balancing supply across multiple regions. Their strategies were subtle but consequential. Towns that aligned with these networks prospered, while those outside them faced greater uncertainty. The cultural influence of these networks became equally significant. Women organized apprenticeships, training not just in craft, but in social negotiation and community leadership. They held gatherings that allowed music, poetry, and philosophy to circulate alongside practical knowledge. In some towns, their sponsorship supported artists, scribes, and scholars, ensuring that cultural life remained vibrant. In doing so, they shaped the rhythm of social life as much as the flow of commerce. Even as these networks quietly expanded, life remained fragile. Rivers could flood, roads could be blocked, and political edicts could threaten carefully nurtured agreements. Yet the women responded with resilience and adaptability, drawing on interwoven networks of trust, skill, and communication. Their influence depended not on formal recognition or coercion, but on practical competence, reliability, and reputation. The fabric of society itself was subtly shaped by these interconnections, creating a world where authority could be wielded with wisdom, patience, and foresight rather than force. As the sun set over canals, market squares, and cobblestone streets, the work of these women continued quietly. Fires glowed in kitchens and workshops, apprentices copied letters, barges prepared for early morning departures, and plans were discussed for upcoming fairs and shipments. There were no proclamations, no heralds announcing authority. Yet in every letter, every workshop, and every coordinated market effort, their presence was felt. Their influence was slow, deliberate, and enduring, stitched into the very patterns of daily life. This growing web of female agency illustrates a central truth of the time. Influence did not always require titles, armies, or legal codification. It could be earned through skill, careful observation, and the quiet cultivation of trust and reputation. Across towns and regions, these women quietly reshaped their world, leaving an invisible yet enduring mark on commerce, culture, and community life. a mark that persisted even in the face of social pressures and legal constraints designed to contain female authority. By the early decades of the 16th century, the influence of these interlinked women had begun to extend far beyond markets and trade routes, gradually infiltrating the subtler currents of political life. Town councils, magistrates, and guild meetings might appear to be exclusively male domains, yet the evidence of women's persistent intervention is woven throughout the records. Often, their power was exercised indirectly, mediated through reputation, strategic alliances, and economic necessity, rather than through the blunt force of office or decree. In cities like Ghent, Bruges, and Lübeck, council minutes show repeated references to disputes resolved not by formal edicts, but through the mediation of well-respected women who commanded the trust of both merchants and local officials. One striking example comes from 1513 Ghent, when a dispute arose between two textile guilds over the quality of imported wool. Male officials were in an impasse for weeks. Finally, a letter from a widow merchant named Joanna van der Vliet, detailing the sources, quality, and historical reliability of suppliers, was circulated among the council. The dispute was settled within days, the council later noting that her insight was both accurate and wise beyond expectation. Her authority was not derived from election or royal appointment, but from the practical expertise she had cultivated over decades of managing workshops and trade networks in smaller towns. These women became indispensable advisors in local governance. They could calculate taxes, assess property values, and predict the outcomes of trade embargoes with remarkable precision. Clerks, often overworked and undertrained, relied on women's assessments when planning public works, scheduling market fairs, or distributing guild privileges. There are accounts of women who were consulted before decisions about public grain storage, water rights, or road maintenance, their advice quietly ensuring that civic resources were deployed efficiently and fairly. In many cases, these women were the only people who truly understood the intricacies of local supply chains, and the towns that ignored their counsel often suffered shortages, price spikes, or unrest. These women also wielded influence by shaping social cohesion and public perception. Their workshops and homes were spaces of discussion, negotiation, and counsel, where apprentices and peers observed lessons not only in craft but in diplomacy. Letters reveal carefully calibrated advice given to mayors and aldermen, phrased as neutral observations, yet carrying clear implications. For instance, a widow merchant in Cologne wrote to the town council in 1521, warning that delays in approving certain textile exports would lead to both economic and social unrest, since weavers and dyers depended on timely shipments for their livelihoods. The council records show they followed her recommendations closely, aware that disregarding her could provoke disorder among the working population. Economic leverage became another tool for exerting influence. Women who controlled workshops, mills, or trading partnerships could adjust production, delay shipments, or negotiate alternative routes, subtly signaling to local authorities the consequences of unfavorable policies. In one remarkable account from 1545 in Antwerp, a group of widows operating a series of cloth workshops collectively refused to supply a city-sponsored fair until a dispute over tax rates was resolved. Within weeks, the council amended its decision, acknowledging that the livelihoods of hundreds and the city's reputation as a trade hub depended on these women's cooperation. This form of power was quiet but undeniable. It relied on interdependence and the careful application of economic foresight rather than overt command. Social networks reinforced political influence in other ways. Women formed close alliances not only with each other, but with sympathetic male merchants, clerics, and minor officials. Letters preserved from Lübeck in the 1530s show women coordinating the distribution of charitable funds, ensuring that the poorest in town received aid, while simultaneously securing goodwill and political backing from council members. These efforts were often framed as acts of piety or community service, masking the very real strategic benefits of cultivating loyalty, reputation, and influence. In this way, women extended their reach without ever needing to sit formally in council chambers. Marriages, Inheritances and dowries remained critical tools of influence as well. While many independent women avoided marriage entirely, others strategically engaged with the institution to maintain or expand their networks. A widow who managed her late husband's estate might arrange marriages for her daughters or younger relatives that reinforced trade alliances, secured political support, or consolidated property across multiple towns. Marriage, when approached with deliberate strategy, became less about personal obligation and more about maintaining an interconnected web of economic and social influence that spanned hundreds of miles. Even church authorities, who had long sought to control female behavior, were not immune to these networks. Women who had amassed both wealth and social capital could negotiate with local clergy on issues ranging from charitable oversight to control of parish lands. Letters from abbesses and wealthy widows often reveal subtle persuasion in religious matters. The placement of funds for charitable works, approval for festivals, or even the direction of sermons. Clerics frequently deferred to these women, recognizing that their influence extended beyond the sacred walls into the daily lives of townspeople. Education and mentorship continued to strengthen this informal power. Older, established women trained younger merchants in both commerce and diplomacy, ensuring that each generation could navigate complex networks of supply, law, and social expectation. Apprenticeship records preserved in city archives show that girls learned bookkeeping, contract management, and negotiation alongside weaving, dyeing, and baking. By passing down practical and social knowledge simultaneously, these women created not just skilled workers, but capable agents of influence who could operate independently across multiple towns. At the same time, cultural and artistic initiatives intertwined with civic and political influence. Women who sponsored festivals, theatrical performances, or manuscript copying ensured that cultural life reflected their priorities, values, and networks. Patrons and artists were often bound by gratitude or obligation, and these cultural ties reinforced women's authority in practical matters. A town council might hesitate to ignore advice from a woman who had funded local apprenticeships, repaired bridges, and supported the arts, knowing that ignoring her could provoke social unrest or economic repercussions. This expansion of influence was not always dramatic or public. There were no grand proclamations or banners. Instead, power manifested in the rhythms of daily life. Shipments arriving on time, workshops running efficiently, apprentices learning rapidly, merchants negotiating confidently, and disputes resolved before they became crises. Authority flowed through knowledge, foresight, and the careful cultivation of trust. It was quiet, patient, and enduring, a power rooted in competence and interdependence rather than coercion. Yet these networks were not invulnerable. Political shifts, wars, and disease could threaten carefully built alliances. Floods, fires, and banditry disrupted trade routes and forced women to rely on contingency planning and deep reserves of patience and skill. Letters reveal careful instructions for alternative routes, emergency storage of goods, and coordination of aid for apprentices and employees. These preparations were not casual. They reflected an acute awareness that survival and influence depended on planning generations in advance. Through these intertwined threads, commerce, mentorship, culture, and diplomacy, women across regions created a subtle but powerful web of influence that challenged the traditional assumptions of medieval society. They shaped the economic and political life of towns, mediated disputes, guided civic decisions, and ensured that knowledge, resources, and cultural innovation flowed efficiently. Their power was not measured in titles, armies, or crowns, but in the enduring stability and prosperity of the communities they touched, the apprentices they trained, and the reputations they cultivated. The result was a medieval world quietly guided by women whose influence was profound precisely because it was patient, understated, and deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life. Their legacy endured not in grand monuments, but in the rhythms of commerce, the strategies of governance, and the networks of mutual aid that allowed towns to flourish, trade to prosper, and culture to thrive. all without the overt recognition that history so often demands be why the mid-16th century. The reach of these independent women had begun to extend far beyond the workshops, markets, and households that had long been their domains. Cities such as Antwerp, Bruges, Cologne, and Lübeck reveal a remarkable pattern. Women whose authority had once been confined to trade and craft now began to influence the very laws and policies that govern civic life. Their methods were rarely public, rarely celebrated, and often invisible to the chroniclers of the time. Yet their impact was profound, steady, and cumulative. The heart of this influence was an understanding that governance was as much about relationships and knowledge as it was about formal titles. Women leveraged economic weight, personal networks, and reputations for fairness to shape decisions in guild halls, council chambers, and courts. A widow who owned multiple workshops could negotiate with the town council over tax rates, presenting meticulous accounts to demonstrate the economic consequences of policy changes. Often, these negotiations were framed as appeals for fairness or civic welfare, but they were grounded in deep strategic awareness. The success of her business and the broader prosperity of the town depended on the council's decisions. In 1548, records from Bruges show that a group of widows controlling textile workshops collectively petitioned the council to regulate imports of cheaper Flemish wool, arguing that unregulated imports threatened not just their livelihoods, but the economic stability of the city. The council, recognizing the wisdom and authority behind these petitions, implemented regulations that balanced trade and protected local industry. Legal influence also emerged as a crucial channel of power. Women familiar with property law, contract law, and customary rights used their knowledge to protect their own interests while shaping precedents that affected entire communities. Court documents reveal women repeatedly appearing as witnesses, advisors, and arbiters in disputes, particularly over property boundaries, inheritance claims, and trade contracts. A widow merchant in Cologne, for instance, successfully argued before the city council in 1552 that her late husband's property should remain under her management rather than being partitioned to distant relatives. Her reasoning drew not only on documented ownership, but on the economic consequences for local workers and trade networks, demonstrating a keen understanding of law, commerce, and social stability. Such cases were often cited in subsequent disputes, reflecting the lasting influence of women's legal acumen. Beyond courts and councils, women shaped civic life through philanthropy, social organization, and the management of urban resources. Hospitals, almshouses, orphanages, and schools often relied on women's oversight and funding. A 1560s letter from Lübeck describes a widow named Katharina Hentz supervising the distribution of funds for apprenticeships and poor relief, ensuring that resources were allocated efficiently and fairly. Her notes reveal careful planning, contingency strategies, and a keen awareness of local politics. She understood that the support of guilds, clergy, and civic leaders was essential to maintain both stability and goodwill. Similar accounts appear across Flanders, Brabant, and northern Germany, showing that women were quietly shaping the social architecture of towns, providing services that strengthened civic life while simultaneously extending their own influence. Cultural influence was another avenue through which these women exerted authority. They sponsored manuscripts, festivals, and music, often linking cultural production with social cohesion and economic stability. A widow in Ghent funded a series of dramatic performances that coincided with the annual fair, ensuring not only entertainment, but also coordination of trade and market activity. Another in Antwerp commissioned illuminated manuscripts that chronicled local economic history, legal customs, and the lineage of merchant families, essentially codifying practical knowledge while preserving her own authority and legacy. Through such endeavors, women shaped public perception, reinforcing their position as indispensable contributors to civic life. Perhaps the most striking feature of this era is the way in which women navigated the tension between independence and social expectation. Even in regions where law technically allowed them to own property, run businesses, and inherit wealth, their position was always precarious. Male officials, clergy, and rival merchants frequently sought to curtail women's influence, arguing that decisions or resources should pass through male hands. Women responded with strategy rather than confrontation. They built alliances, cultivated reputations for fairness, and framed their influence as beneficial to the community. A widow merchant in Lubeck, for example, ensured that her charitable donations were directed to both guilds and city authorities, securing goodwill that made it politically unwise for male officials to challenge her economic or social authority. Education remained a critical foundation of influence. Women who had built wealth or social capital often provided instruction to younger women in literacy, numeracy, trade practices, and civic knowledge. Guild records from Antwerp in 1557 show that apprenticeships for girls were increasingly formalized, with experienced widows providing instruction in bookkeeping, negotiation, and conflict resolution alongside craft skills. This knowledge transfer ensured continuity of influence. Each generation of women was equipped not just to survive, but to shape their communities, trade networks, and civic policies. Networks of support and communication were essential to this strategy. Letters, ledgers, and account books reveal women coordinating across towns and regions, sharing intelligence about market conditions, political developments, and legal challenges. This communication created a distributed system of influence, allowing women to intervene or advise in multiple locales simultaneously. For instance, a widow in Cologne might relay information to relatives in Bruges about impending market restrictions, enabling coordinated petitions or negotiations. The resulting web of influence resembled an informal intelligence network, quietly guiding trade, law, and governance without any formal authority. Women's role in conflict resolution further demonstrates their strategic reach. In disputes between guilds, towns, or merchant families, women often acted as mediators, drawing on personal relationships, economic stakes, and reputation to broker compromises. A notable case in Antwerp in 1562 involved a conflict between two major weaving guilds over access to imported silk. A committee of widows, experienced in both weaving and finance, convened meetings, reviewed contracts, and proposed equitable solutions. The resolution prevented strikes, ensured continuous production, and maintained the city's reputation as a reliable trade hub. Their authority derived from practical competence, not formal office, yet it shaped outcomes that affected entire urban populations. Religion continued to intertwine with civic and legal influence. Women often used their piety and charitable activity to assert authority while remaining socially acceptable. Donations to churches, endowments for liturgical festivals, and support of monastic institutions enhanced reputations and created leverage. Clerics frequently deferred to women whose networks and resources were essential to maintaining urban stability. Letters from convents describe women advising on parish affairs, resolving disputes between clergy and laity, and directing charitable funds, all while framing their actions as devotion rather than ambition. Why the latter half of the 16th century, the cumulative effect of these strategies was clear. Women had carved out a sphere of influence that extended across trade, law, governance, and culture. They did not sit on thrones or wield swords, yet their presence shaped civic life in subtle but enduring ways. Town councils, magistrates, guilds, and courts were all influenced by the judgment, expertise, and networks of women who understood that quiet authority, exercised patiently, strategically, and competently, was often more lasting than formal power. Even when new laws or rulers attempted to curtail women's influence, these networks proved resilient. Knowledge, reputation, and interdependence could withstand short-term interventions, ensuring that influence persisted across generations. Letters, ledgers, and council notes from the period show repeated instances where women's interventions were credited with preserving trade, preventing conflict, or stabilizing municipal finances. In many cases, officials relied on women's insight more than their own bureaucracies, recognizing that experience and competence outweighed formal hierarchy. In this way, independent women of the 16th century quietly transformed the civic landscape of Europe. They taught lessons that would resonate far beyond their lifetimes. That influence is not only wielded in courts or halls of power, but also through knowledge, prudence, and the cultivation of networks. That stability and prosperity can be quietly guided by those who understand the intricate machinery of society, and that autonomy, patience, and strategic foresight can reshape entire communities without overt confrontation. Their story is not one of conquest or spectacle, but of sustained, methodical, and intelligent engagement with the systems around them. A reminder that power need not always be loud to be transformative, and that sometimes the greatest revolutions unfold quietly, in the everyday management of lives, trade, and LAW as the 16th century progressed into the 17th. The quiet networks of independent women that had once operated primarily within the marketplace, guilds, and local civic councils began to intersect more directly with the levers of regional power. What had started as localized influence evolved into a sophisticated, almost invisible system that touched the courts of kings, the chambers of princes, and the decision-making of regional governors. It was subtle, nuanced, and remarkable. Women who had long been masters of commerce, law, and urban governance now wielded influence that could shape taxation, trade policy, and even diplomacy, without ever holding formal office. Consider the case of Elizabeth von Hohenfeld, a widow of a minor noble in the Rhineland. She inherited not only estates and businesses, but also her husband's connections to various town councils and trading networks. Through careful correspondence and alliances with both civic officials and regional magistrates, Elizabeth ensured that her estates were exempt from arbitrary taxes, while simultaneously negotiating preferential trade terms for merchants who supplied her workshops. Her letters, preserved in local archives, show a remarkable attention to political nuance. She would congratulate officials on recent successes, subtly remind them of her economic importance, and offer mediation in disputes between guilds, all in the span of a few elegantly written lines. These interventions, though informal, often had consequences more immediate and tangible than any law passed by the regional diet. Women like Elizabeth also became indispensable intermediaries between cities and the emerging territorial states. During times of conflict, whether it was localized uprisings, border disputes, or military levies, authorities recognized that the cooperation of powerful widows and unmarried merchants could ensure the smooth collection of taxes, the supply of resources, or the maintenance of social order. In Lubeck, letters from the council to wealthy widows between 1570 and 1600 repeatedly refer to esteemed matrons whose counsel and support were crucial to the city's ability to meet obligations to the Hanseatic League. These women were not simply financial contributors. They acted as advisors, negotiators, and stabilizers in situations where male leadership alone could not ensure compliance or continuity. Even monarchs began to take notice. A widow who had built an empire from textiles, shipping, or finance could no longer be dismissed as inconsequential. In the Low Countries, correspondence from the governors of Brabant and Flanders reveals repeated appeals to women managing estates and workshops, requesting both logistical support and strategic guidance. The state understood that a single well-connected woman could influence dozens, even hundreds, of workers, suppliers, and merchants, effectively steering the economic and social currents of entire towns. Monarchs, governors, and advisors had little choice but to recognize and engage with this influence, even if official records attempted to obscure it. Diplomacy, too, became an arena in which women quietly shaped events. Letters and petitions show widows and unmarried merchants negotiating safe passage for traders, mediating conflicts between city-states, and even influencing the movement of goods during wartime. They used the tools they had mastered over decades: reputation, networks of trust, meticulous record-keeping, and a profound understanding of human behavior. For instance, a widowed merchant in Antwerp negotiated a temporary truce between competing guild factions over access to import licenses, using her personal credibility and the promise of mutual economic benefit. This intervention, recorded in both civic and guild archives, prevented violence, maintained production, and ensured the continued flow of revenue for the city. But these women's influence extended beyond the purely material or economic. They shaped the legal frameworks that governed urban and regional life. By repeatedly engaging with courts, drafting petitions, and providing testimony, women helped codify precedents that protected property rights, clarified inheritance laws, and regulated commerce. In Cologne, widows were frequently called upon as arbiters in disputes between male merchants, their judgments carrying weight precisely because they were perceived as impartial, knowledgeable, and experienced. Their very presence in these proceedings helped normalize female participation in governance, creating subtle but powerful cultural shifts in the understanding of authority and competence. Religion remained a critical vehicle for influence. Women who were patrons of churches, abbeys, or convents often used spiritual authority to bolster civic and political engagement. Abbesses and lay widows alike could frame interventions as acts of piety, charitable service, or moral duty, allowing them to participate in affairs of state without attracting overt hostility. In many instances, correspondence from bishops and abbots reveals a grudging acknowledgement. Women who controlled resources, networks, and social influence were essential to maintaining the moral and economic stability of their regions. These women had mastered a dual strategy. They exercised power openly when necessary, but cloaked it in the language of duty and devotion, deflecting criticism and ensuring continuity. Education and knowledge remained central to this influence. Women who had spent decades mastering accounts, legal codes, languages, and trade practices were uniquely positioned to advise and guide others. Apprentices, young widows, and unmarried women entering commerce often turned to these experienced mentors, creating a generational continuity of expertise. In some cases, these networks intersected with male scholarship and governance. Women taught mathematics, accounting, and rhetoric to sons of nobles, guild clerks, and council officials. By doing so, they ensured that their insights were embedded into the broader culture, subtly influencing decision-making in ways that left no written proclamation but left indelible marks on outcomes. What makes this period extraordinary is how these women balanced influence with survival. Male-dominated institutions were rarely welcoming, and open displays of ambition could provoke retaliation. Women's strategies were careful, nuanced, and adaptive. They relied on reputation, reciprocity, and networks of trust rather than direct confrontation. They leveraged the economic and social weight they had built to negotiate rather than command, persuading rather than dictating. In doing so, they achieved remarkable results. Policy adjustments, market protections, legal clarifications, and civic stability, all driven by the quiet but formidable power of women who had refused to be confined by the strictures of marriage, male oversight, or social expectation. The period also saw the beginnings of intergenerational influence. Wealthy widows and independent women began establishing endowments, schools, and trusts that ensured their strategies, values, and influence persisted beyond their lifetimes. They codified practices, taught apprentices, and used religious and civic institutions to preserve autonomy, knowledge, and networks. This long-term thinking reflects a level of strategic sophistication rarely acknowledged in conventional histories of the era. These women were not acting for immediate glory. They were shaping the structure of society for decades, even centuries, to come to be why the early 17th century, the cumulative effect of these networks had become undeniable. Towns with strong traditions of female independence, like Lübeck, Antwerp, and Cologne, were more economically resilient, socially cohesive, and politically stable. The women who managed estates, workshops, and charitable institutions had become central nodes in the machinery of regional governance. Their authority was largely informal, invisible to many chroniclers, yet it influenced everything from taxation and trade to law and diplomacy. And yet, the broader society remained ambivalent. Religious and male authorities were often suspicious of women's power, framing independence as dangerous or unnatural. Laws were periodically proposed to restrict inheritance rights, control guild participation, or limit property ownership for women. But the networks these women had built, combined with their ability to operate subtly and persuasively, allowed them to withstand repeated pressures, preserving influence while shaping society in ways that would take centuries to fully recognize. Through all of this, these women demonstrated a rare mastery of strategy, intellect, and subtlety. They understood how to translate economic and social capital into political influence, how to navigate legal and religious constraints, and how to ensure their actions had lasting impact. In every town, every guild hall, and every council chamber where their presence was felt, they reshaped expectations of what women could do, what they could achieve, and how they could leave a lasting imprint on the world around them. The story of these women during the late Renaissance period is a testament to the power of patience, intelligence, and strategic action. They were rarely celebrated, often invisible in official chronicles, yet their influence was profound and enduring. They had learned that the true strength of independence was not in overt conquest or public spectacle, but in the careful, sustained shaping of society through knowledge, networks, and principled action. They had transformed not only their own lives, but the communities, economies, and institutions around them, quietly, persistently, and with extraordinary skill. As the 17th century deepened, the world that these independent women had so carefully shaped began to feel new pressures. The slow, patient networks that had sustained commerce, law, and local governance were suddenly confronted with forces far larger and more impersonal than any merchant guild or town council. The rise of centralized states, professional armies, and increasingly codified legal systems. Kings, princes, and governors, armed with formal authority, taxation powers, and bureaucracies, viewed the autonomous influence of widows, unmarried women, and matronly merchants as a threat to their growing control. Yet, even as pressure mounted, the women did not simply yield. They adapted, resisted, and in many cases transformed the very structures that sought to limit them. The tension first became visible in urban centers. In cities like Antwerp, Cologne, and Lübeck, edicts appeared, attempting to regulate who could own property, run workshops, or serve in guilds. Women who had long acted as mediators in legal disputes were now formally restricted from participating, under the pretext that governance required male leadership. Taxes were increasingly levied to favor crown-backed monopolies, threatening the independence of family-run workshops and trading enterprises. Letters from town councils reveal frustration at these changes, not because of male weakness, but because the women's networks had previously ensured the smooth operation of commerce and social order. The absence of these mediators now threatened bottlenecks in supply chains, disputes between guilds, and tensions among merchants, showing just how central women had been to the functionality of society. Despite these obstacles, the women's response was neither panicked nor overtly confrontational. They relied on decades of accumulated knowledge, personal networks, and moral authority. In some cases, widows leveraged marital connections and inheritance laws to retain control over estates. In others, they invested in charitable institutions and religious foundations, framing their influence as acts of piety and public good, making interference politically risky for authorities. A remarkable example comes from a widow in Utrecht who, when her workshop faced closure by a new tax decree, used her network to coordinate relief efforts for impoverished families, framing her business as essential to civic welfare. Officials, fearing public backlash, quietly allowed her operations to continue, demonstrating the continued subtle power these women wielded even under formal restriction. Yet in some regions, confrontation was inevitable. Legal battles emerged in courts across Europe as authorities attempted to reclaim control over estates, trade monopolies, and inheritance. In cases recorded in both city archives and private correspondence, independent women often faced multiple suits simultaneously, some aimed at restricting their property rights, others at invalidating their commercial contracts. The women responded not with force, but with meticulous documentation, testimony from apprentices and clients, and appeals to religious or moral authority. Their ability to navigate these complex legal landscapes, sometimes winning, sometimes losing, revealed not just resilience, but an extraordinary understanding of human and institutional behavior. Military conflicts also brought challenges. Wars between states disrupted trade networks, imposed new levies, and demanded conscription of male labor. In these moments, women's influence was paradoxically both more vulnerable and more crucial. In cities under siege or facing occupation, widows and independent merchants often organized supply chains, negotiated with occupying forces, and maintained local governance in the absence of men. Their actions were essential to the survival of towns and cities. Yet they drew suspicion from central authorities, who worried that these women's networks could serve alternative power structures. Again, the women adapted, balancing public compliance with private coordination, ensuring survival while retaining autonomy wherever possible. By mid-century, the cumulative pressure of centralizing states, codified law, and militarized conflict forced a transformation. The informal, sprawling networks of women that had operated for decades began to shrink and fragment. Some chose marriage or strategic alliances. Others retreated into charitable and religious endeavors, and a few maintained clandestine networks that would quietly persist beneath the radar of official records. What was striking was not the elimination of their influence, but its persistence in subtler forms. The mentoring of apprentices, the careful management of estates, the codification of legal and commercial knowledge, and the embedding of women's authority within moral, religious, and civic frameworks. Even in apparent retreat, their imprint on society endured in the final decades of this period. Chroniclers, historians, and official records often ignored these women entirely, framing political, economic, and legal developments as products of male leadership. Yet the evidence of their influence remained. Cities that had been centers of female-led commerce continued to thrive. Legal precedents protecting property and inheritance endured, and networks of mentorship ensured that knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The legacy of these women was not in overt titles or visible crowns, but in the very architecture of society they had helped stabilize, organize, and guide by the late 17th century. The era of direct female autonomy in commerce and civic life had waned, yet the patterns they established shaped what came after. Their methods of negotiation, their emphasis on education and mentorship, and their subtle exertion of influence left an indelible mark on law, commerce, and civic culture. Towns that had absorbed these practices were more resilient, adaptable, and prosperous, while women in subsequent generations could draw upon the strategies and knowledge left behind to assert influence within new social frameworks. In this sense, the women's struggle was both temporal and enduring. Their immediate visibility diminished, but the consequences of their labor, foresight, and intelligence rippled through centuries. The story ends with a quiet affirmation. Even when authority seeks to erase autonomy, networks of intelligence, strategy, and influence persist. The women who once navigated guild halls, court chambers, and city councils left behind more than wealth or property. They left systems of knowledge, methods of subtle power, and examples of resilience that would echo long after the last workshop was closed and the last court petition settled. Their legacy is neither loud nor celebrated, but it is undeniable, embedded in the fabric of society, in ways both visible and invisible, proving that influence need not be recognized to endure, and that the quiet work of strategy, mentorship, and foresight can shape the course of history. The era closes with the understanding that history often overlooks those who shape it quietly. But the imprint of intelligence, courage, and perseverance endures, waiting for those who know where to look. And in the alleys, council chambers, and markets of Europe, long after the last independent merchant or widowed strategist passed, the strategies they perfected, the networks they built, and the systems they influenced continued to guide human action in subtle, persistent, and powerful ways.